The fireman froze in place at the sight of the raging fire that had already engulfed everything around him. The name Contegan was visible on the oxygen tank. The main character, whose face was protected by a mask, looked at the flames with horror. It was clear that for him, this was all for the first time. Soon, Contegan began his duties and picked up the fire extinguisher, thinking about how long and hard he had studied and trained. However, the guy admitted that he was only part of a human chain. These thoughts haunted the protagonist and slowed down his work. At the same time, the fire spread more and more throughout the room, and weakened supports caused the ceiling to collapse. Even though he was surrounded by fire on all sides as if in hell, Contegan prayed in fear for rain. The protagonist's hands were shaking. He couldn't cope with it, and therefore didn't dare to start acting. Meanwhile, the uncontrolled flames had already completely engulfed the industrial complex. The bright light from the fire was visible far away, but even further away, thick black smoke was visible. The atmosphere of alarm and danger was aggravated by a sudden clap of thunder and a bright flash of lightning that momentarily illuminated the night sky. Soon a light rain began to fall, which unfortunately could do little to help in the current situation. Several teams of firefighters desperately tried to quell the fire by pouring water from hoses onto it. The group commander, who stood out from the others by the color of his protective helmet, loudly gave orders, transmitting them over the radio. Suddenly, one of the firefighters turned to his colleague and asked in a calm voice if he was scared. The man, although smiling, confirmed this and then suggested that it would happen today. Hearing this, the first fireman asked his friend again if everything was good in this life. The man replied that it had not been so before, but now it was good. The protagonist looked at his colleagues and prayed to God to let the flame take what it wanted and give it a voice that the guy could hear. The fireman looked back and, despite the flames raging around him, told his friend that they should have saved that madman anyway. The man, looking in the same direction, agreed with the words of his colleague, saying that they could not have acted differently. The very frightened protagonist looked at his comrades and continued to ask God to prepare him when his turn came. Suddenly, one of the firefighters turned to Contegan, who was separated from them by a wall of flame, and asked him to continue living. The next moment, the main character screamed in horror, which, against his will, he had to witness with his own eyes. A sudden explosion sent a stream of fire straight at the people, causing them to burn alive. Tegan could no longer do anything, so he just watched as his colleagues died before his eyes. As soon as the call came in, the fire brigade immediately arrived at one of the houses that was still under construction. The rescuers immediately cut off the area, not allowing onlookers to get close. One of the firefighters took a few steps forward, examining the site of his work today. The guy carefully checked his equipment to make sure he was protected as best as possible. The name Contegan on the oxygen tank indicated that this guy was the main character who was ready to do his job. The guy was tense and therefore exhaled and inhaled heavily in order to try to come to his senses. The main character looked at the flame, smiled slightly, and thought that it would probably be a bit hot today. Contegan admitted that he had seen huge tongues of flame burst out of the windows of the top floor of a multi-story building, and had only confirmed what had been said earlier. Suddenly, one of the firefighters came up from behind, lightly hit the main character on the protective helmet, and addressed him. Contegan looked at the man standing next to him in surprise, not understanding why he did this. This man was the commander of the fire brigade. The man asked the guy with a displeased look what was funny here, and suggested that he had come for a picnic. Contegan, afraid of angering the commander, immediately began to deny it. Then the man, without taking his eyes off the flame, asked why the guy was smiling. The man continued calmly asking if the main character was in his right mind. Contegan was shocked to hear this question, and looked at his commander with incomprehension, not knowing what to answer. The guy quickly came to his senses and stood at attention, loudly answering that his mental state was normal. Having received an answer to his question, the commander looked strangely at the main character as if he did not fully believe him. The man had already asked if Contegan remembered that he had just been given permission to enter, that he was following me. The guy, without another word, confidently confirmed this. Suddenly, the commander rudely said that the guy would die if he just stood there like last time. Contegan was a little taken aback, but asked the man not to worry about it. The man praised the guy, patting him on the shoulder, and said that the excitement would only increase further, and therefore it was necessary to be prepared for this. After this, the commander turned to his subordinates and asked them to get it. They fell silent and listened to him attentively. All the firefighters immediately fell silent as ordered, which indicated that the commander enjoyed great respect among them. The man again asked his colleagues to listen to him carefully, because he was going to give instructions. The man began to say that they knew that during welding work, sparks got onto another device, which immediately caused a fire. The commander then warned that since the building was still under construction, there were many flammable substances in it, so it was worth being careful. Having made sure that everyone had heard, the man ordered his subordinates to move forward. All the firefighters immediately headed off to perform their official duties. Kang Tae-gon, along with his new comrades, also headed forward, trying to cope with a little excitement along the way. Suddenly, the commander turned to the main character and ordered him to stand. The guy immediately obeyed the order and looked at the man with incomprehension. The man rudely pointed his finger at Kang Tae-gon and told him to stay 3 steps away from the main group. The guy was surprised but didn't object at all. Hearing this conversation, one of the firefighters began to laugh loudly, considering it funny. The guy continued to laugh. Consider that all this was shameful for the main character. Kang Tae-gon could only look at his colleague with displeasure. Suddenly, the commander hit the fireman, whose name was Song Yu, on the protective car and said, "Come on, he better worry about himself." The guy immediately apologized. After that, the man said that he and the main character were 2 peas in a pod, so they should stick together, which made Sung Yu laugh again. Soon all the firefighters took their positions at the entrance to the burning building and prepared to carry out the next order of their commander. As soon as the man gave the necessary signal, the firefighters began to extinguish the fire that was blocking them by pouring a powerful stream of water on it. The flames easily came out of the water, but this required time and absolute concentration from all firefighters. The main character also took part in this, holding a fire hose tightly in his hands. The flow of water inside the sleeve was very strong, so Kang Tae-gon had to make a lot of effort to keep it from slipping out of his hands. As soon as the view increased sufficiently, the commander warned his subordinates that he would be going inside and ordered them to follow him and be vigilant. Suddenly, one of the firefighters turned to the main character. The guy immediately understood that he would now be assigned to perform some task, so he prepared to listen carefully. The man handed Kang Tae-gon a trident-like instrument and told him to take good care of the coals and guard the entrance to the building carefully. The fireman emphasized that the guy had to put out one coal after another until there were none left. Kang Tae-gon began to assure that he understood everything. The man called the main character a kid to make sure and asked him again if he understood everything. The main character confidently confirmed this again. The house inside was already completely engulfed in flames, even on the first floor. The presence of building materials and tools indicated that this house was not yet inhabited, so there was no need to worry about danger to people. The main character, as he was told, carefully extinguished the burning coals using a simple tool. Despite the presence of a mask that fit tightly to the face and an oxygen tank on the back, it was still difficult to breathe here because of the acrid, thick smoke. Physical labor in such conditions quickly took all of Kang Tae-gon's strength. Nevertheless, the boy offered to do important work. For a moment, the main character stopped, and let's see what was happening ahead. Ahead of him, his comrades fearlessly entered the fire and poured powerful streams of water on it in order to extinguish the fire. This surprised Kang Tae-gon so much that he could not tear his eyes away from this spectacle. The main character was surprised by how his colleagues, without hesitation, entered the fire, which was 10 times higher than them, and decorated it using a fire hose. There were no impulsive movements in the rescuers' work, but only verified step-by-step methods of struggle. So the guy thought that the name Fire Ghosts was very suitable for their team. The sight was so incredible that Kang Tae-gon couldn't take his eyes off it. However, the guy quickly remembered his work, looking at the tool in his hands, and realized that now he did not have time to rest. The main character thought that he was also part of the team and was doing an important job that ensured the safety of everyone who was inside the burning building. Kang Tae-gon was about to continue performing his duties, but he stopped. The thing was that some strange sound that was not typical for this situation attracted the attention of the main character. The guy immediately looked in the direction from which the sound was coming and began to listen carefully, intending to hear it repeated. Kang Tae-gon looked at the construction stairs that led to the second floor. He was told that he heard a strange sound in that direction. The premonition completely took over the protagonist's attention, preventing him from returning to his duties. Kang Tae-gon kept looking at the stairs and thinking that maybe he should go up and scout out the situation. The main character also suggested that it might be easier to storm the second floor, which was also very flaming. However, the guy did not forget about his captain, who could punish him for doing this without permission. This was a serious argument, so Kang Tae-gon turned around and went to do his job. The guy was cleaning up the coals and thinking that the captain probably wouldn't have given this task if it hadn't been important. However, the main character thought that it was mediocre and not cool at all. Meanwhile, the rest of the firefighters moved deeper into the building, slowly stepping across the floor where the remaining water was spilled. The captain led a detachment of his colleagues behind him and loudly spoke in which direction they should direct the flow of water. All subordinates dutifully carried out orders, thanks to which the flames around became smaller and smaller. The captain asked his colleagues not to rush and to stand still for now, because something could collapse at any moment. The subordinates all obeyed as one and continued to hold the fire hose tightly so that it would not jump out due to the strong flow of water. At this time, Contegan continued to extinguish the coals that could cause new fires and block the exit. Nevertheless, the guy occasionally looked forward because he was very interested in watching how his more experienced colleagues worked. The main character tried his best not to get distracted and asked himself to focus on his work and not look at the work of others. Suddenly, Contegan froze in place because he heard that same unusual sound again. The main character carefully looked back, trying to listen and determine what kind of sound it was. However, the boy's curiosity and premonition got the better of him, and so he left his job. The main character again approached that same construction ladder, puzzled by the question of what kind of strange sound he had heard several times already. Contegan did not dare to go up to the second floor yet, considering that it could all just be his imagination. Suddenly, the strange sound was repeated, but much louder. Now the main character was absolutely sure that it was a small puppy squeaking. The guy understood that he urgently needed to do something, but he had a difficult choice about what he should do first. The main character doesn't know whether he should have reported everything to the commander first or gone to the second floor himself without wasting time. This dilemma took the guy some time, but he finally took the first step and stepped onto the stairs. Contegan was also helped to make his choice by the fact that, in the guy's opinion, there was no flame raging on the second floor yet. Still, the main character decided to go and see, thinking that perhaps there could have been other victims. The guy couldn't believe that his own feet were carrying him to his death. Contegan carefully climbed the scaffolding, using his hands to help himself. The main character thought that he needed to be more careful because the ladder was very shaky and unreliable. Contegan takes careful steps and climbs higher and higher up. Occasionally, the guy would stop and look ahead to make sure the path was safe. Having risen quite high, the main character was suddenly taken aback by what he saw in front of him. Contegan stared at the thick clouds of smoke rising up without looking away. Although this mesmerizing view was dangerous, it also caused incredible feelings in the guy. However, Contegan quickly came to his senses and continued to climb the stairs, telling himself that he had no time to be surprised. Soon, the main character took his last steps and was almost on the second floor. As expected, the second floor of the house was also engulfed in flames, but it was still possible to walk along it without harming oneself. The main character began to look around, trying to determine what could have caused this strange sound. As it turned out, there really was a puppy on the second floor who, judging by his appearance, was not very happy to see the guy. Contegan immediately went to him trying to help, but growling loudly and baring his teeth, the animal did not want to let the stranger near it. Soon the main character saw that the puppy was tied by a collar and therefore could not save himself. The guy realized that it was not in vain that he went up to the second floor, because without his help, the animals would definitely not have been able to escape. The main character carefully extended his hand to the little angry dog, telling her not to be angry because he had come to save her. Suddenly, a small puppy bit a guy. I don't understand at all that they didn't pose a danger to her, and unlike the fire that was around. Contegan was very unhappy with the animal's reaction, but still did not scold him and humbly endured the pain. Soon the guy grabbed the puppy in his arms despite his desperate resistance and quickly freed him from the leash. The main character, hiding the puppy in his bosom, was surprised at how the animal was not ashamed to bite the helping hand when everything around was blazing with fire. After this, Contegan approached the stairs on which he climbed to the second floor and considered that he should have been even more careful when going down than when going up. The main character went down and was already preparing to carefully and slowly put his foot on the stairs. The next moment, the scaffolding began to collapse with a deafening roar from just one step of the protagonist. The guy was very scared and couldn't believe what had happened, and also that he almost fell down from the second floor. The streak of luck did not end there. Contegan heard strange sounds, so he raised his head up to see what was happening. Suddenly, burning debris from the ceiling began to fall directly on the main character, which scared him so much that he had to bend down and cover his head with his hands. Soon everything ended, but the guy was so scared by what happened that for some time his whole body trembled with fear. Still, the main character had enough strength to open his eyes and realize that everything was okay with him, despite the strong fear. However, the worst was yet to come. Contagon's face distorted in horror as soon as he saw what was happening below. On the first floor, there were many pieces of the staircase that were completely engulfed in bright flames. Contagon looked down in horror and could not believe that all the scaffolding had been destroyed and he was trapped. Having seen all this, the main character has already regretted several times that he climbed to the second floor. Finding himself in a fiery trap, the main character hoped that there was another descent from the second floor nearby. Looking around, Contagon was very surprised to see so much fire and did not understand when it had managed to spread so much. The guy accepted with great disappointment the fact that the flames were on all sides and were gradually approaching him. Immediately after this came the realization that at this rate, he could die here. This thought greatly alarmed the main character. Contagon was distracted from these thoughts by active movement inside his protective jacket. The same puppy that the guy saved tried to get out without understanding what was happening or where he was. The main character looked with regret at the movement inside the jacket and was very upset that two people would have to die at once in this all-consuming flame. Contagon hugged the puppy in order to calm him down a little so that he wouldn't be so scared. After that, the active movement stopped. The main character seemed to be completely desperate in his situation, so he threw away the tool for extinguishing the coal, because he definitely could not help in this situation. However, this was not the case. The guy hugging the puppy in his jacket thought that he absolutely had to survive. The main character needed to take some action quickly because he no longer had time to hesitate. Contagon looked down, trying to determine how high it was. He showed the guy that the ground floor was about 4 meters away. The main character was about to jump, but the thought that he could fall on the reinforcement worried him. Still, the guy thought that it made no difference how he died. Contagon walked up to the edge and, already getting ready to jump down, asked the puppy whether he was ready for what would happen next. Suddenly, the main character saw a drop of water flying straight at him in front of his eyes. This surprised the young fireman very much. The next moment, a huge stream of water rose from the first floor and headed straight for Contagon. Cold, life-saving water immediately doused the guy from head to toe, who was still shocked by the sudden turn of fate. Soon the flow of water changed its direction, giving the main character the opportunity to come to his senses and realize everything. The guy looked down in surprise to understand what had just happened. It turned out that standing on the first floor, one of the firefighters came to help Contagon. From the bright orange stripes on the firefighter's protective suit, it became clear that this savior was the guy's boss, who could not leave his subordinate in trouble. The main character sighed with relief because it meant that he would be able to survive, but the thought that something was wrong again greatly alarmed the guy. Contagon was puzzled by the question of why his boss was here now and not putting out the fire with the others in another part of the building. In any case, the man was here and fearlessly fought the flames in order to save the main character, and even the burning debris falling from above could not frighten him. Contagon was very worried about his boss and asked him to be careful because he was in danger. At the same time, the man was absolutely calm and only loudly asked what the guy was saying because he was completely inaudible. The boss was also interested in where his subordinate's radio had gone. Contagon did not hear this question because he also did not hear anything because of the protective mask, so he asked the man to use the radio. The main character was still very scared and worried that now both he and his boss could die. Suddenly, a loud and nasty screeching sound echoed through the burning room. Someone was quickly moving an iron structure across the floor. After this, the main character heard someone loudly addressing him and asking him to jump down. Contagon looked away in confusion. On the first floor, the guy saw another colleague of his who was moving the scaffolding closer to the main character. This surprised the guy very much. The fireman asked Contagon to jump down faster again. The boy immediately recognized that voice. It belonged to Song Yu. The man assured that he held the scaffolding well, so the main character could not worry and trust him. Since there was no other choice, Contagon walked to the edge and prepared to take a step forward, hoping that everything would go well. The young firefighter's boss watched what was happening carefully, not forgetting to put out the fire surrounding the guy. Sung Yu held the scaffolding tightly to ensure the utmost safety for his colleague. Gathering his courage and hugging the puppy tightly inside his jacket, Contagon took a step forward into the unknown. The main character quickly flew down from a great height. Now he could only hope for his luck. The huge fire that broke out in an unfinished multi-story building was only extinguished late at night, but even after that, there were still a lot of sparks flying around. The rescuers were already rolling up their fire hoses and were ready to head back because their work was finished for today. However, not everyone had come to their senses. One of the firefighters sat to the side and was still shaking because of what had happened to him today. Kang Tegan looked at his hands in surprise, which could not stop shaking, although the worst had already happened long ago. Suddenly, the main character noticed his colleagues who, having completed their task, were heading in his direction. One of the firefighters looked at the guy, called him an idiot, and said that he knew that the new guy would cause them problems someday. The second fireman asked why in that case, the man didn't scare the main character so that he wouldn't do something stupid. His colleague answered, but nothing could stop the fool. Hearing this, Sungyu looked at Kang Taegon and couldn't help but laugh. This made the protagonist displeased, but he didn't say anything. Suddenly, the commander who was walking behind and heard everything threatened his subordinates and told them not to talk too much because they still had to clean everything up. Kang Taegon closed his eyes, trying not to meet the man's gaze, because he felt uneasy because he felt like he had let him down. However, the commander stopped right next to the guy because he wanted to talk to him. The man stood silently and looked at Kang Taegon as if he understood what he was feeling. The boss raised one eyebrow in surprise because he saw something strange. First, I saw the same puppy saved by the main character who seemed to be looking at the boss with displeasure. At the same time, Kang Taegon still sat with his eyes closed, afraid to look at the man and get a reprimand from him. Suddenly, the main character, still not daring to raise his head, began to say something quietly and timidly. The guy turned to his boss and thanked him for not abandoning him and saving his life. Despite these sincere words, the man did not react to them at all and asked what happened next. This discouraged Kang Taegon so much that he looked at his boss and forgot about his worries. The boss asked the guy again what happened next. Kang Taegon immediately apologized for acting without his permission. The man was glad that the main character understood everything. After that, the commander sat down next to the guy and, exhaling heavily, said that he had not listened to him at all and that things could have ended in trouble. Kang Taegon simply remained silent. Then the main character would silently look at his boss, who at that time was wiping sweat from his face. The man noticed the guy's gaze and immediately understood that he wanted to ask him about something, so he didn't rush him. Finally, Kang Taegon, trying to restrain his trembling hands, turned to his superior. He immediately prepared to listen to his subordinate. The main character, looking down, timidly asked if the man was scared. The commander heard this and immediately clarified what the guy meant when he was putting out the fire next to him. After that, the man laughed and thought that he looked cool then. Kang Taegon was very surprised at how the boss recalled such a terrible event so carefree and with humor. The main character immediately asked if the man at that moment was not at all afraid of getting hurt since everything was collapsing around him. At first, the man only smiled slightly as if he was amused by the boy's naivety. Nevertheless, the chief briefly confirmed that he was not afraid of anything, despite the danger that surrounded him at that time. Kang Taegon was very surprised to hear this answer and asked the man what was the reason for his fearlessness. He briefly replied to the commander that he did it because there was a person there who needed urgent help. The main character looked at his boss with great surprise, wanting to get a more detailed explanation. The man continued to say that he did it without a doubt, because that person was Kang Taegon. Silence reigned in the large metropolis. Nothing was left to remind us of the recent misfortune associated with a fire in a building under construction. Having received an answer to his question, Kang Taegon looked at his boss with incomprehension, expecting him to say something else. Having waited for nothing, the main character asked if that was really the whole answer. To this, the man asked what other reasons there could have been. This question stumped Kang Taegon, and so he had to spend some time thinking about it. Still, the guy lowered his head and replied that he didn't know that. Then the boss began to say that there was nothing more important in the world than human life, and even the stupidest person would choose it over any money. Kang Taegon still bowed his head and thought seriously about these words. The main character then replied that this was not the case, and that he would also have chosen life in such a situation. The boss interrupted his subordinate and said that it was their job, and the reason they needed to put out the fire was to save someone else's life. The man continued to say that it was already the guy's problem if he didn't realize it. Kang Taegon thought these words were quite true, but he didn't expect that it was all so simple, so they didn't cause him any particular emotions. Unexpectedly, the boss asked him to answer honestly whether the guy became a firefighter only because it was a government service. Caught off guard, the main character answered that this was one of the reasons. Hearing this answer, the man smiled slightly and was surprised by the main character's naivety. The captain continued to say that the boy immediately confessed as soon as he pressed lightly. However, the man did not think that it was bad. Kang Taegon did not understand what the boss was talking about. The man explained that the main character was now also a fireman, so he should reconsider his point of view on this matter. The guy, although hesitantly, agreed with this. After this, the boss put his hand on his subordinate's shoulder and began to rise from his seat, preparing to say something last. The man said that it was okay to have your own point of view, but Kang Taegon should have kept something in mind. Suddenly, the protagonist interrupted his captain and said loudly that he should have kept in mind that human life was above all else. The man immediately grabbed his ears and asked with displeasure why the guy was screaming so much, since his eardrums almost burst. After this, the commander assumed that the main character had already come to his senses if he had shouted like that. The guy asked for forgiveness for this, saying that he had overdone it a little. Then the man noticed his subordinate's legs, which were shaking violently. This shaking spread to the whole body. The boss laughed at this, drawing Kang Taegon's attention to the fact that his legs were still weak. The main character immediately began to deny it and say that everything was fine, but at the same time he could not stay on his feet and began to lean to the side. The guy barely managed to stay in place. The boss responded that Kang Taegon almost died today, so he had no reason to feel normal. After that, the commander asked if the main character stopped. It was scary when he remembered what happened to him today. Kang Taegon answered honestly that he still had goosebumps on his skin, realizing that today he could have said goodbye to his life. Then the guy hinted that if he drank alcohol, he would feel better. To this, the boss replied that it would be better for the main character to spend time with his family. Unexpectedly, Kang Taegon, in order to convince the man, said that today he was treating. Hearing this, the man also changed his mood and said that the main character finally understood something. The captain continued to say that a family is when people can rely on each other, but he suggested not to take Song Yu with him. The guy said that he should have treated him too for saving him. Then the captain warned his subordinate that Song Yu ate a lot, especially if it was free. This did not frighten the main character, who assumed that today he would go a little bankrupt. The boss immediately loudly declared that at this rate it would happen quite soon. Kang Taegon showed that he was already feeling better, so he tried to get up from his seat. The main character thanked his boss for encouraging him. Thanks to this, the guy could already stand on his feet. The man didn't respond to this and just held the guy back just in case to prevent him from falling. Suddenly, the captain saw something behind him that really caught his attention. In the distance, a woman could be seen bowing respectfully to the firefighters, as if thanking them for something. At the same time, a little boy ran up to the puppy saved by the main character. The man instantly realized everything and praised Kang Taegon for his good work. The main character was very surprised by such sudden words and therefore asked again what the captain meant. The boss explained that the dog was also a living creature that deserved to be saved, so the men thought that the guy had tried hard. However, the commander warned his subordinate that we should not wait if we act just as recklessly next time. In a small cauldron, the water had already boiled for a long time, as evidenced by the hot steam escaping from under the lid. The main characters, as promised, decided to treat their saviors and therefore brought them to one of the establishments. Soon our heroes received their orders and prepared to have a good evening, and for this, Sung Yu had already begun to open a bottle of alcohol. Opposite each one stood a large kazan bowl filled with rich broth and several small plates with meat. Looking at this meager table, Kang Taegon felt that he should order something else. The boss was very surprised to hear this and assumed that the main character had quite a lot of money. Kang Taegon immediately confidently confirmed that this was true, but it was unclear whether he was telling the truth. Sung Yu said that in that case, the guy would treat them to dinner tomorrow too. The protagonist agreed to this without hesitation. After this, the captain suggested to his colleagues that they should have a glass rather than pointlessly stuff their bellies. Sung Yu immediately supported the boss's idea. The man praised the guy for knowing how to have a good time and asked him to explain everything to the new guy. Sung Yu turned to the main character and shared his wisdom with him, saying that there was nothing better than drinking and enjoying the company of loved ones. Kang Taegon agreed with this, but also added that there were other ways to have a good time. Sung Yu raised his glass to this and asked the guy to shut up while the adults were talking, because the boss said to drink, which means they will drink. After this, the main character began to open a bottle of alcohol and suggested that his colleagues remind him of their glasses. The boss immediately put his glass forward, not letting Song Yu go ahead. This surprised the boys, but the captain said that the eldest one should have poured first. Kang Taegon did not argue with this, and first reminded his boss of the glass. After this, the man, without letting go of the glass, suddenly stood up from his seat, surprising his colleagues. The captain began to solemnly and loudly say that the today that they were living was the tomorrow that those who died yesterday were waiting for. This toast attracted the attention of not only the captain's colleagues, but also everyone present in the establishment and even the staff, but the man was not at all embarrassed. At the same time, Sungyu and Kang Taegon were ashamed of their boss, so they asked him to sit down. However, the captain continued to wish for the hangover to come tomorrow, and today they would allow the alcohol to flow like a stream. After that, the loud sound of glasses hitting each other spread throughout the hall. Some time passed. It was already deep night, so the streetlights were burning as never before. Our heroes were also near one of these lanterns. Sungyu felt very ill after their impromptu party, which is why he couldn't stand on his feet. The boss began to call a taxi, asking Songyu to get up on her feet. Kang Taegun also told his colleague that it was time for them all to go home, but the guy did not react. After this, the commander also asked if the main character was okay. The guy confirmed that everything was okay with him. He was just a little dizzy from the thought that he could die today without having a glass of wine or a taste of hot rice soup. The boss laughed and was surprised that the guy had only just realized that he could have died. Kang Taegun sighed heavily and said that this life was difficult to live. After that, there was silence. Each of our heroes thought about what worried him the most. The boss silently looked at his subordinate, understanding that sooner or later he would ask a question, and therefore he had to be prepared. It turned out that the man was right. Soon the main character really did turn to him. Kang Taegun asked him directly how he had learned to put out the fire so well. This question surprised the captain. The main character humbly waited for an answer, thinking that the boss probably had some kind of secret and hoped to find out this secret. At the same time, the man, without looking away, was surprised at what he was asking. Unexpectedly, the main character confidently declared that he also wanted to learn to do it as well as his boss. The surprised man asked if the guy really thought there was some secret to doing it right. Kang Taegun looked at the captain in surprise, not believing that there was no such secret. Hearing the conversation of his colleagues, Songyu seemed to immediately come to his senses and began to listen attentively to what his boss would answer. It was clear that the captain hesitated and did not want to answer the protagonist's questions. In the distance, the taxi our heroes had been waiting for appeared. It turned out to be a lifesaver for the man. The boss immediately suggested that the main character talk later, but now his subordinate had to go home. After Kang Taegun put his drunk colleague in the car, the captain approached him to say something. The next moment, the man absolutely seriously and mysteriously stated that the fire was alive. These words greatly surprised the protagonist. Kang Taegun looked at his boss in silence with confusion, wanting to get more explanation from him. However, from the barely noticeable smile, it became clear that the boss left the solution of this riddle to the guy himself. After that, the car started moving. Kang Taegun came to his senses from the sudden statement and stuck his head out the window and loudly asked what the man's words started, but he pretended not to hear him. The taxi sped off into the distance without giving the main character a chance to get an answer to his question. Morning came. The next rescue team began its work in the fire department. Two men walked down the corridor without discussing Kang Taegun. One of them asked his colleague to tell him what had happened, since it was not a military secret. The fireman said that rumors had reached the others that the main character had done something wrong again, so he needed to be given a warning. Suddenly, the boss, who had heard this conversation, turned to his subordinates and asked what kind of warning should be given to the new guy. The man was immediately frightened by the menacing look of his captain, who was clearly dissatisfied with what he heard. The boss, defending his new subordinate, asked whether the men themselves had never been newcomers. He also said that he remembered well how these firefighters used to shake with fear. The men could not find an excuse for themselves, so they just looked away. In the end, the boss threatened that if the man continued to chatter and spoil the working atmosphere, they would be in trouble. The commander also said that the elders should have provided support at first, then the young people would treat them well later. This conversation was interrupted by the entrance door suddenly opening. Another firefighter arrived at his workplace. This firefighter was the main character, who was already dressed in a bright orange rescuer's uniform. It seemed that Kang Taegun was nervous for some reason, which is why he was biting his lower lip. Seeing his colleagues, the guy loudly wished them good morning. The boss and his subordinates immediately stopped their conversation and turned their attention to the main character. As if in accordance with regulations, Kang Taegun put his hand to his head and loudly reported that he had already arrived for duty. The men looked at the main character silently and with incomprehension, wondering what had come over him. At the same time, the chief's face was strangely distorted, as if he was trying to hold back laughter. The next moment, the loud laughter of men echoed throughout the fire station. After some time, the firefighters went out on another call. One could say that their work was just beginning. Upon return, all vehicles involved in extinguishing the fire were serviced and carefully parked in order to be ready to hit the road again at any moment. The jacket and protective helmet hanging on hangers indicated that now the city's residents could not worry about their safety, since the rescuers' work had already been completed. Sung-yu hides his things in the closet and asks the main character if he only has 50 more days left. The guy is sure and confirms there. His colleague continued to say that after these days, everything would end more fun for the guy and serious work would begin. The main character just laughed and agreed with this. Sung-yu unfortunately said that those days when the main character whined and got into trouble would seem like heaven to him. Kang Tae-gon didn't understand what they were talking about because a month had already passed since then. Coming out of the locker room, the main character continued to say that it was really scary that time, after which he asked if his colleague Sung-yu was scared, and he reluctantly confirmed it. After a hard day's work, the firefighters headed straight to the cafeteria. Their footsteps echoed down the empty corridor. One of the men was sweating from fatigue and said that he was very hungry. The firefighters walked quickly forward to have lunch, because they did not know when the next call would come in. In order not to waste precious time, rescuers could only afford to wipe their dirty hands with wet wipes. From the outside, it seemed that everything was calm in the fire station, but this was not entirely true. One of the men carelessly threw his things down and loudly complained that they had not had time to eat because they had arrived too late from the call, and the canteen was no longer open. His colleagues supported this idea and said that despite the fact that everyone in the station was one family, they were not shown care. Suddenly, the chief addressed Choi Chong-yun, who was a firefighter in the second team of the Guro firefighters. The man immediately began to listen to him attentively. Lee Chaeon, who was the head of the 2nd Fire Brigade, asked his subordinate to stop chatting and look for something to do. Choi Chong-yun began to be indignant. I don't understand why he had to do it. The boss said that it didn't matter to him whether a man or someone else did it. Choi Chong-yun understood everything and therefore began to loudly call the newcomer. Kang Tae-gon immediately understood that they were talking about him, but did not understand what his colleague could need from him. The main character immediately approached Choi Chong-yun, telling him that he was here. Approaching the man, the inspired guy asked why he was called. Choi Chong-yun was very happy to see the new guy and put out his hands to grab him. This made the main character very wary. Still, having grabbed the guy, the man asked if he knew what he was supposed to do now. Contegan replied that now he would go check for food and snacks. Soon the main character was already in the kitchen and checking all the pots and gastronorm containers that could be opened. As it turned out, the kitchen was empty. There was not even a hint of any food. Kang Tae-gon looked at the pots and surprise. Commander Lee Chaeon asked the protagonist to take out the kimchi from the refrigerator and cook the ramen that was supposed to be left over. As was said, Kang Tae-gon went, but Lee Chaeon asked his subordinate not to turn up his nose and eat first, since they didn't know when the next call would be. After this, suddenly the boss said that if his subordinates were so slow, by the time they finished preparing all the fried pork, there would be no pork left. Kang Tae-gon looked at his colleagues who looked funny from the outside and asked his boss if they always behaved like that. They were very happy to hear this. Park Sung-yu heard this and as always laughed and asked his boss not to worry about it. The guy promised that he would take care of the new guy. The commander reminded that Sung-yu was the same, and as in his opinion, everything was already ready. The others weren't too keen on the idea, since the noodles had only recently been doused with boiling water. The man insisted that the ramen could have been eaten as is. Still, the rest agreed, although they were not sure that it would have a good effect on their stomachs. After that, the firefighters wished each other bon appétit. Suddenly, the lunch that had not started was interrupted by a loud siren that attracted the attention of Chief Lee Chaeon. Everyone immediately stopped their meal because they understood what this loud sound meant. Park Sung-yu didn't even have time to touch his portion of food and froze in anticipation of what would happen next. Kang Tae-gon was still a newbie, so he wasn't yet used to that shrill sound and everything that followed it. Suddenly, someone dropped their chopsticks because now it didn't matter at all. Chief Lee Chaeon loudly announced to his subordinates that they had to go to the call. As indicated in the rules, the firefighters, without wasting a second, jumped up from their place and ran to their cars. The main character ran along with everyone, not lagging behind, because he had studied for a long time precisely for such moments. Running to the exit, Lee Chaeon turned to the main character. Ott immediately began to listen attentively to what the boss would tell him. The man suggested that Kang Tae-gon return before the food got cold, as if hinting that he would cause trouble here. The guy understood what his boss was hinting at, so he promised not to let him and the rest of the team down. All the firefighters, without slowing down, ran out into the garage, where a car and equipment were already waiting for them. Meanwhile, it was very noisy near the fire station. The sound of the running engines of the cars that were taking turns responding to the call could be heard all around. Despite the rush, everyone acted clearly and harmoniously. A loud voice ordered the third team of firefighters to go first, and then the first. Choi Chong-yun continued to run and asked his boss if all the teams would be going out on a call today. Lee Chae-yeon assumed that it was so. Then the man asked how serious it was. The commander asked Choi Chong-yun to shut up and get into the car. The protagonist had never faced such a serious challenge before. Soon all our heroes were already climbing into the fire truck and were ready to leave. Only a few minutes had passed by the time the call came in. The car immediately moved from its place and, turning on the siren and flashing lights, left for the call in order to get to the necessary place as quickly as possible. In order not to waste time, the firefighters put on their gear right in the car. At the same time, Lee Chae-yeon asked his subordinates to listen to him carefully. The chief had already received all the necessary information, so he had to pass it on to the other firefighters. The man began to tell that a fire had recently broken out at the oil warehouse of the company Best Oil. Everyone was shocked to hear this. Choi Chong-yun asked where exactly this warehouse was located. Sung-yu was about to answer this question, but he was interrupted. Chief Lee Chae-yeon said he was near the IC in Bucheon district. Choi Chong-yun asked if it wasn't the area with residential buildings and the captain's factory. Then another man said that it wasn't their jurisdiction, and that meant only one thing. Lee Chae-yeon confirmed his subordinate's guess and said that the fire that broke out in the warehouse was on the second level, and that's why absolutely everyone was heading there now. After these words, silence reigned in the car, because everyone, even the newcomer Kan Tae-gon, understood how serious and dangerous the second-level fire was. Meanwhile, fire trucks making their way along the night roads were getting closer and closer to the site of the fire, which was already clearly visible from afar. The silence in the car was broken by Chief Lee Chae-yeon, who again asked his subordinates to listen to him carefully. The man said that this challenge was an extremely serious matter, so everyone should be more careful. The captain also threatened with a menacing look that all those who screw up today will be severely punished. At this point, the briefing was over, so all the firefighters could turn on their radios. Everyone immediately obeyed. Kan Tae-gon also turned on his radio and tuned to the desired radio wave. Suddenly, he heard someone's voice. This voice on the radio ordered the first team to quickly report the situation if they had already arrived at the scene. To this, the commander of the first team asked what they should focus on. There was also an order coming from the radio for the third team to retreat if they didn't want to get fried. Choi Chong-yun asked if that voice belonged to the fire chief. Lee Chae-yeon replied that a level 2 fire was no joke, so the chief couldn't send only his subordinates to the epicenter. Choi Chong-yun was about to express his dissatisfaction, but his boss interrupted him and said that they would discuss it later. After that, Lee Chae-yeon asked his subordinates to stop chatting since they were almost there. Finally, the captain asked his subordinates not to lose their heads while working because it could end in disaster. Kang Tae-gon immediately realized that this mainly concerned him since he was a newbie, but now you will see what a level 2 fire was like. It was clear that the main character was very nervous, but he desperately tried to restrain himself and not show it. The fire truck continued to drive quickly along the empty night streets of the city, using its siren and flashing lights along the way. The thick black smoke and bright flames that raged at the scene of the incident were clearly visible from afar. One of the firefighting teams was already actively extinguishing the fire, which was spreading rapidly. The commander loudly ordered his subordinates to split up and stay on the lines. It seemed that the fire and acrid smoke had already engulfed the entire industrial complex. There was not a single building nearby that had not yet been reached by the flames. Sung-yu, like the rest of his colleagues, were amazed by this sight and thought that this was no longer a joke. Kang Tae-gon was also shocked and did not believe that this fierce element was a second-level fire. The raging fire around him, which the main character looked at with wide-open eyes, caused him only fear and numbness. Suddenly, someone from behind hit the guy lightly on the protective helmet in order to bring him to his senses. Kang Tae-gon, with fear in his eyes, immediately turned his head to the side to see who did it. The main character was very surprised when he saw this man next to him. It was Chief Lee Chae-yeon who reminded her subordinate that he should not lose his head. The guy immediately responded loudly that he understood everything and would not create problems for the boss. The captain also asked the main character not to rush and promised that he would come to his aid if necessary. Kan Tae-gon, adjusting his helmet, said that the most important thing was to keep oneself in hand. The man confirmed this. After this, a firefighter who stood out from the rest with his blue helmet approached Chief Lee Chae-yeon. It was the chief of the fire station, Park Min-seok. The man said that it was necessary to prevent the fire from spreading to a neighboring tank with chemicals. To do this, it was necessary to spread the extinguishing agent to the fire before it spread further. Li Cheon, without further questions, had already prepared his protective mask and replied that he understood his task for today. Park Min-seok looked to the side and continued to say that the flames were not raging so strongly now, but caution was never unnecessary in their business. The chief of the 2nd Fire Brigade responded to this by saying that he and his subordinate would act in accordance with the order. Park Min-seok asked the man to hurry up. Lee Cheon immediately turned to his subordinates and said that today they needed to prevent disaster. He then asked Choi Chong-kyun and Kang Tae-gon to stay put, and Sung-yu to take the fire extinguisher with him and follow him. No one objected to this order. Following his colleagues, the main character asked them to be careful. Sung-yu laughed at the fact that the newbie was worried about them. Lee Cheon said that this guy should have been more careful and reminded that out of everyone, he was the one who was new here. Before heading out to carry out the dangerous disease, Lee Chi-yeon and Park Sung-yu paused for a moment to assess the situation. There was no fear in the eyes of the firefighters, only determination and a strong desire to complete the task. After the instructions were given, Chief Lee Cheon asked if everyone was ready and loudly ordered them to move out. Park Sung-yu obeyed his superior's orders without asking any questions and followed him. The firefighters, with fire extinguishers in their hands, fearlessly ran straight into the burning building from which huge tongues of flame were bursting out and thick black smoke was pouring out. Kang Tae-gon, for a while, he liked to be surprised by the fearlessness of his colleagues, but there was no time for all this. Choi Chong-yun asked the guy not to just stand there but rather take the fire hose. The main character immediately fulfilled the request and firmly grabbed the hose so that it wouldn't fly out of his hands from the powerful gust of water. At this time, a strange sound was heard nearby, which immediately attracted the attention of Chief Park Min-seok. Kang Tae-gon heard a sudden explosion nearby, after which he saw a huge flame burst out from a nearby building. This shocked the main character as well as everyone who saw it. The guy was dumbfounded on the spot and could only look at the fire with wide eyes. One of the firefighters said with horror that the explosion occurred in the building that Park Sung-yu and the chief entered. Chief Park Min-seok immediately radioed the 3rd Fire Brigade and asked what had happened behind them. It turned out that a chemical warehouse in the building on the left had exploded. Hearing this, the man ordered all the firefighters to start putting out the building on the left, since that was where the leader of the 2nd team went. All the firefighters immediately began to carry out the chief's order and pour water on the raging flames in the building on the left. At this time, the main character could only stand still and look at the building that his comrades entered without looking away, despite the fact that they asked him to come to his senses. Kang Tae-gon recalled the words of his superior who, not long before, had suggested that he return from the mission before the food got cold. The main character could now only stand still and look at the flames, because his body did not obey him at all due to severe stress. The guy also remembered the words of Lee Cheon, who shortly before entering the burning building asked the main character to be careful. Kang Tae-gon still stood there and thought about what the captain and Song-yu told him to stay here. Suddenly the guy clenched his teeth tightly, thinking at the same time that this time he would disobey the order again. After this, the main character threw down the fire hose and, leaving his comrades, quickly ran somewhere. Choi Chong-yun looked at the running guy in surprise, not understanding what he was going to do. The main character's antics shocked all his colleagues, who were momentarily distracted from their work. It turned out that Kang Tae-gon took 2 fire extinguishers in his hands and ran to that very burning building because he was very worried about his comrades. The firefighters who saw this were shocked and could not believe that this rookie was going to go in there. Chief Park Min-seok also did not take his eyes off the main character and could not utter a word from surprise. Meanwhile, Kang Tae-gon had already approached the entrance, which was completely engulfed in flames. The main character stopped for a moment and looked in horror at what was happening right in front of him. Huge tongues of flame burst out of the room and enveloped the walls of the building. Kang Tae-gon looked at all this with wide eyes and for some time did not dare to go inside. The guy was frightened by the sight of a whole wall of fire that was emitting thick black smoke. Kang Tae-gon quickly came to his senses when fire once again burst out of the building and almost burned him. Chief Park Min-seok, still shocked by what was happening, loudly addressed the main character as crazy. The guy immediately asked for forgiveness for disobeying the order and promised that he would write an explanatory note later. After this, Kang Tae-gon, despite the boss's order to quickly return back, began to fearlessly run inside the hot building. 3 fire engines were deployed to extinguish the fire in the building, but the results were insignificant. Inside the building, even the metal supports were completely engulfed in bright flames. At the same time, An uncontrollable fire was also bursting out from the ventilation shafts on the roof. The main character grabbed two large fire extinguishers in his hands and intended to enter the burning building and help his comrades. Despite the fear that he intended to stop, the guy couldn't abandon the people who had already risked their lives for him. Kang Tae-gon continued to run forward despite the voices calling him crazy and asking what he was going to do. Chief Park Min-seok screamed and couldn't believe that the guy wasn't going to return even when ordered by his superiors. After that, the man turned to Choi Chong-yun and asked, as the representative of the 2nd Fire Brigade, who this crazy guy was. Choi Chong-yun looked at his colleague with displeasure and replied that it was a newcomer named Kang Tae-gon. The man continued to say that this guy who was going to literally walk into the fire without fear was the youngest of their team. Hearing this, Park Min-seok began to get even more nervous because he didn't believe that a newbie could handle something like this. The next moment, unexpectedly for everyone, another explosion thundered in the burning building. Firefighters were afraid that it could be a chemical tank that exploded. Someone's voice immediately calmed the men down and said that if that were the case, they would all fly into the air right now. Park Min-seok quickly came to his senses after the sudden explosion and began to shout loudly into the radio so that Kang Tae-gon would immediately return back because this was the boss's order. The main character heard this message well, so he stopped immediately. His legs were shaking from fear and excitement. The guy looked back at where his comrade stood with the boss, as if considering whether he should obey the order. Park Min-seok looked at the main character with wide eyes because he already knew what would happen next. Despite the danger of the situation and the orders of the top leadership, Kang Tae-gon confidently ran forward, ignoring his fear and other negative consequences. Kang Tae-gon fearlessly looked danger straight in the eye and intended to do what he had to do. The flames burned the main character, but he managed to quickly run past them and get inside. Choi Chong-yun looked at this and was stunned and could not believe that this crazy new guy actually ran in there. Park Min-seok began to get very nervous because another one of his subordinates was in danger, but he could not influence the main character in any way. Suddenly, the chief turned to the other firefighters and began to scold them for not doing anything. The man loudly asked if the firefighters were ashamed to just stand and watch while the rookie risked his life. The firefighters immediately reacted to what they saw and began to douse the raging flames with large amounts of water from a fire hose. The work to extinguish the fire continued. Chief Park Min-seok gave orders and asked his subordinates to clear the way in the direction where the entrance to the building was. Meanwhile, Kang Tae-gon was already inside the building, engulfed in flames, and was moving forward, trying to get his bearings. It was difficult to do this because the flames were raging everywhere, and therefore everything turned out to be the same and very dangerous. The main character desperately wandered around the room trying to find his comrades, but so far everything was in vain. The sudden flashes of flame burned the boy, but they couldn't stop him. Kang Tae-gon endured the high temperature and continued to move forward. The thick smoke was so dense that it penetrated under the main character's protective mask, making it difficult for him to breathe. The guy looked around trying to find his comrades, but saw only fire around him. The protagonist began calling his boss and Sung-yu by name, but none of them responded. Kang Tae-gon continued to advance forward and loudly announce his presence. Meanwhile, the flames inside the warehouse grew larger and larger, consuming absolutely everything around them. The main character did not pay attention to this and continued to take careful steps forward, trying to shout to his comrades. The guy looked around carefully, but no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't find them in this hell. As he moved further into the burning room, Kang Tae-gon suddenly noticed a bright white light that was unusual to see among the orange-red flames. This color was so bright that the main character had to squint his eyes to avoid going blind. Suddenly, the guy saw that right in front of him was the very epicenter of the fire, which was a huge white spot. Kang Tae-gon was shocked by this sight and couldn't believe that this was right in front of him. The guy thought that the white flame appeared only at temperatures above 1,000 degrees, and if he touched it, it could consume him entirely. Just one look at this dangerous phenomenon made the protagonist's legs start to tremble. Kang Tae-gon felt like the white was gradually spreading and was about to swallow him up. The trembling in his hands indicated that the main character was very afraid and could not force himself to go through this. Suddenly, a premonition told Kang Tae-gon to look to the side, which he immediately did. The raging flames greatly obscured the view, but the main character was still able to make out something in the distance. Behind the wall of fire, the guy saw Chief Lee Chae-yeon and Sung-yu. He immediately informed them that he was here. The firefighters were very surprised to see a newcomer in this hell. Sung-yu thought that his colleague was a real psychopath for coming here. The boss immediately asked the guy why he was here. Kang Tegan was still very excited about finding his comrades and therefore could not answer questions properly. Lee Chaeyeon ordered the guy to go back, but Sung-Yu noticed that the flames had spread widely and therefore they should all go out together. Kang Taegan agreed with this and said that they should try to do it. To this, the boss rudely asked the guy not to talk nonsense and go get a few more fire extinguishers. Still very worried, Kang Taegan said that it was too late to go alone and if he went, he would surely die. Suddenly, the main character noticed something, which made him immediately fall silent and think. The guy noticed that the direction of the flames spread had changed and his comrades were putting out the fire from the other side. He also saw through the thick smoke a tank with chemicals around which there was no fire at all. Kang Taegan remembered how Park Min-seok told his boss that they couldn't let the fire reach the reservoir or else it would be the end for them all. Lee Chaeyeon promised not to let that happen. At that very moment, the main character realized what was happening, which made him dumbfounded on the spot, and even the raging fire around him could not bring the guy to his senses. Kang Taegan stood there with his eyes wide open, thinking about how his colleagues had acted to their own detriment in order to prevent the fire from reaching the tanks. In order to save liquid in the fire extinguishers, Sung-Yu and Lee Chaeyeon stopped leaving themselves a path to retreat and were now trapped in a fire, so the guy thought that the boss was even crazier than him. Meanwhile, Chief Lee Chaeyeon continued to do his job but suddenly stopped to look back. The man saw the main character and was surprised that he still hadn't left the burning building. After stopping to put out the fire with the fire extinguisher, Lee Chaeyeon turned to his colleague and said that in his opinion, they would not be able to survive here. Sung-Yu calmly agreed with his boss's words and added that those who remained outside were not fools to come in here and save them. Chief Lee Chaeyeon exhaled heavily, as if he had resigned himself to this situation. Sung-Yu also exhaled because he couldn't imagine any other outcome. After this, the boss looked at his subordinate in order to see his eyes before the inevitable end. It turned out that Sung-Yu was already looking at the man as if he wanted to tell him something last. Suddenly, Lee Chaeyeon asked his friend if he had lived a good life. Sung-Yu said that he wouldn't have thought that way before, but now he could confidently say that he had lived a good life. Hearing this, Chief Lee Chaeyeon just remained silent, not knowing what he should say about his life. Still, the man said that they still needed to save that crazy newbie who came after them. Sung-Yu agreed with this. The chief loudly addressed Kang Taegan and asked him not to worry about them and to come out, after which he pointed his hand in the direction where the exit had been cleared. The protagonist was still very frightened by what was happening around him, so he asked if Lee Chaeyeon was telling him the truth. Hearing this, the boss said that they were not fools and could find a way out themselves. Sung-Yu asked the protagonist to listen and bring more fire extinguishers. Kang Taegan replied that he had already brought them, and therefore suggested that they all go out together. Sung-Yu didn't understand whether the guy didn't hear them or just ignored Lee Chaeyeon sighed heavily, surprised at how stubborn the main character was. The man then said that they would not last long, and if they did not force Kang Taegan to leave, he would also die. Sung-Yu was of the same opinion. After this, Chief Lee Chaeyeon suggested dragging the guy out by force since he had nothing to do here. Sung-Yu agreed, because even if the main character was lucky and only got a slight fright and scratches, it was still better not to risk it. At this time, Kang Taegan intended to try to break through to his comrades and from there go together to the exit. Suddenly, Lee Chaeyeon and Sung-Yu used their fire extinguishers to spray the contents into the huge flames, but not to put them out. Seeing this, the main character was very surprised because despite the fact that he was a newbie, he understood that doing this was pointless. However, Chief Lee Chaeyeon had a different goal. Due to the temperature difference, the iron supports on the ceiling began to crack with a loud noise. This loud sound attracted the attention of Kang Taegan, causing him to raise his head up in fear. The next moment, the guy saw heavy iron beams flying straight at him. The main character immediately jumped to the side to avoid being crushed, but he hit the floor hard. It took the guy some time to recover from such severe stress. Soon the main character remembered his comrades and looked up to see if everything was okay with them. Through the raging flames, Kang Taegan saw his colleague standing calmly in place and looking straight at the guy. Sung-Yu's face was completely serene. It seemed like he had long since come to terms with what was about to happen to him. Chief Lee Chaeyeon also did not express any concern, and only hoped that the main character would be able to get out of here alive. At the same time, Kang Taegan looked at his comrades with horror in his eyes, because he realized that despite what they had said earlier, they were not going to leave the burning building. Trying to get to his feet, Kang Taegan turned to the chief and reminded him that he had recently said that there was a safe exit here. The man will answer that if he hadn't said that, the guy would have gone to save them, But he didn't want that because the boss thought that it was too early for the main character to engage in heroism. Kang Taegon looked at his comrades with wide eyes and understood that they would not be able to get out of here alive. These thoughts really scared the guy. Clenching his fist tightly, the protagonist began to think that his brothers had just sacrificed themselves, so he asked God to allow him to somehow help them. Kang Taegon also asked to be allowed to understand what the flame wanted and to finally hear the voices of his comrades. The next moment, the fire completely engulfed Sungyu and Chief Lee Chaeyeon, who had already prepared for this outcome. Kang Taegon, watching this, did not believe what was happening and regretted that he could not help his comrades. Finally, the main character heard the voice of his boss, who asked him to save himself. Chief Lee Chaeyeon and Park Sungyu, unable to withstand the heat of the flames that engulfed them, fell to the floor dead. Kang Taegon, who had all this happen right before his eyes, could not believe what had happened and only looked at the bodies of his comrades with wide eyes. Meanwhile, the raging fire gradually burned through the firefighters' protective suits and spread ash throughout the area. This sight brought tears to the main character's eyes. He could not contain his emotions. The next moment, the guy fell to the ground and screamed loudly from despair and his helplessness. The main character's head began to spin with the thought that he couldn't just leave, because then his death would be meaningless. He couldn't live with the thought of leaving the corpses of his colleagues behind. Trying to get to his feet, Kang Taegon continued to think that even if he died now, at least he would not be ashamed in front of others. He decided that now it was his turn, and so he was ready to meet God. Rising to his feet and looking at the flames that had engulfed his comrades, the boy asked God to have mercy on him and give him the strength to accomplish his plan. Meanwhile, the situation on the street remained just as unfavorable despite the diligent work of several fire crews. Chief Park Min-seok contacted one of his subordinates via radio and asked if they could somehow find out what was happening near the chemical tanks, but the answer was negative. The man explained that nothing could be seen because of the smoke. In addition, the roof had collapsed, so it was impossible to get inside. Upon hearing this unfavorable news, Chief Park Min-seok ended the conversation and turned off his radio. After this, the man tightly clutched the radio in his hands, realizing the complexity and danger of this situation. Gritting his teeth, the fire chief resigned himself to the fact that the workers who ran inside the burning building could no longer be saved. Suddenly, the firefighter, who judging by the bright orange stripes on his uniform was one of the radar team leaders, turned to the chief. The first team leader, a firefighter named Oh Kwani, asked if the man was okay. Park Min-seok did not respond to this and only asked. At the same time, Chief Park Min-seok, without taking his eyes off the entrance to the burning building, the rescuers held the fire hoses tightly in their hands and directed the flow of water in the right direction. His comrade knew that if the fire reached the tanks, everything here would be exposed. Soo-yeon was confident that the boss and Sungyu were not fools, and therefore they would be able to prevent the explosion. Suddenly, one of the firemen took a loud step forward, ignoring the puddle of water under his feet. There was a whole cloud of smoke around him. This caught the attention of Cho Gyu-chung, who looked away and was very surprised by what he saw. The other firefighters also noticed it and couldn't believe their eyes. The fireman pulled his comrade's hand, whose protective suit was badly burnt. At the same time, the exhausted firefighter carried another colleague on his back, who was also badly injured by the fire. Choi Chong-yun was very surprised to see this picture and could not utter a word upon seeing it. Now, the main character was not ashamed to look his colleagues in the eyes. Barely standing on his feet, the guy raised his eyes upward. Barely restraining himself from losing consciousness, the main character finally said that it was very hot there. The next moment, the guy fell to the ground from exhaustion. His work was done for today. Seeing this, Choi Chong-yun became very afraid for his colleague and loudly shouted his name. Several firefighters immediately rushed to help the victims while asking Kang Taegon to come to his senses. Chong-yun asked Seo Soo-yeon to take the chief and Pyo In-chul to carry Sungyu to a safe place. Choi Chong-yun himself began to listen. The man managed to briefly bring the boy to his senses, and Lee Chaeyeon's lifeless body lay on the ground. There was no chance that the man could survive after this. After that, the guy looked at Sungyu, hoping that at least he showed some signs of life, but this was not the case. Looking at this, the main character remembered how he managed to put out the flames around his comrades, but he could still get them out of here. The main character, having lost his mind from severe stress, turned to his comrades and promised that he would take them to a cool place. Kang Taegon could no longer help but feel neither regret nor fear. His entire range of emotions had been completely suppressed. He now looked like a ghost. Someone's gaze on him, so he immediately looked away. It was Choi Chong-yun who looked at the guy with burning eyes. He felt sorry for his young colleague who had to go through this. Making an effort and looking towards the main characters, I saw another comrade. Cho Ju-chung was also there. Kang Tae-gon was quickly given first aid and taken away on a stretcher. Although the boy's eyes were closed, he was still conscious and mentally asked for someone to turn off the sirens. The main character remembered a quiet summer day. A slight wind swung the next call. Lee Chae-yeon took a deep breath because he felt good, because the wind was so refreshing. Park Sung-gyu was surprised that his boss spoke in such a calm voice, as this had never happened before. After that, the guy holding the protective mask in his hands began to be indignant that the man gave him such a cheap gift. The boss replied that when the guy ends up in the window, he will really need it. Asked the time until the next call. To this, Chief Lee Chae-yeon mysteriously replied that the flame also had its own rhythm. The man continued to say that even the raging fire sometimes took a breather, and they should have noticed this moment immediately. Suddenly, the boss calmly looked at his hand burning with fire and said that if his colleagues could feel this moment, they would be able to overcome the flame. Placing his protective mask on the bench, Song-yu agreed with his boss. Something strange was happening to his comrades, so he immediately turned to them to warn them that they were in danger. Protagonist and thought that he would be able to cope with his duties perfectly. Right before Kang Tae-gon's eyes, his comrades were burning, which made him very nervous, not understanding what was happening, but he could not do anything about it. The next moment, he was lying in a hospital room. A guy in a dark blue suit was standing with his back to him. When the stranger put on his glasses, he had already come to his senses, and therefore immediately turned around. Cho Gyu-chung saw the main character sitting in his bed and asked in surprise if he had already come to his senses. Kang Tae-gon asked if he was in the hospital. Alarmed by such a surprise, the guy confirmed this and asked if the main character felt well. Hearing this question, Kang Tae-gon assumed that from the outside he looked bad. Cho Gyu-chung knew what his friend was talking about and began to remember what could have happened to him recently. Suddenly, Kang Tae-gon was stunned and opened his eyes wide because he remembered everything. The guy immediately started to get nervous and try to get out of bed, saying that they urgently needed to put out the fire. Cho Gyu-chung stopped his friend and said that he couldn't get up yet. However, the main character insisted on his own and said that they needed to prevent the explosion of the chemical tank, so they needed to go quickly. Cho Gyu-chung grabbed the boy by the shoulders, not letting him get up from the bed, and asked him to control himself. Kang Tae-gon looked straight in. The guy looked at the chest badge with the inscription, Firefighters of the Republic of Korea, and listened to his friend who said that everything had already been put out and the tank had not exploded. Cho Gyu-chung continued to tell the surprise protagonist Chief Lee Chae-yeon. Hearing this, Kang Tae-gon immediately calmed down and began to think whether all of this was true. But Kang Tae-gon really wanted to see his injured colleagues. Suddenly, another visitor entered the room and said that he was already afraid that the fire ghosts were not the suspected visitor. It turned out that it was Chief Park Min-seok, who personally honored the main character with his visit and walk. Hearing this, Park Min-seok thought that he could waste no time and immediately get down to business, namely reprimanding Kang Tae-gon for not obeying his orders. After that, Park Min-seok addressed the new recruit Kang Tae-gon in a loud and rude voice. The guy had already Tae-gon did not know what to answer to this question. Park Min-seok conversation with Lee Chae-yeon, during which the boss said that he did not understand what was happening to all the members of the second team, who did not think about themselves at all when it came to saving others, so they did not need to listen to anyone. Park Min-seok threatened his subordinate not to joke like that here, because all this was very serious. Lee Chae-yeon replied that he knew about it and understood that it was only him who was to blame, since it was he who could not cope with them. While Park Min-seok was recalling all this, there was absolute silence in the hospital room. Kang Tae-gon and Cho Gyu-chung humbly waited for the man to answer them. Still, the fire chief sighed heavily and smiled slightly. The man then recalled the saying that the apple doesn't fall far from the tree, and thought it was a perfect fit for the second firefighting team. Still, Park Min-seok made his subordinates talk frankly. Kang Tae-gon and Cho Gyu-chung were very surprised by this and began to listen carefully to what the man would tell them. First, the fire chief turned to the main character. The guy tensed up, expecting to receive another reprimand. The man began to say that disobeying orders at the scene of the incident was certainly a violation of the rules. It was clear that Kang Tae-gon completely agreed with this and did not deny it, feeling ashamed. Suddenly, Park Min-seok's trembling hand timidly reached out to the protagonist, intending to do something. The fire chief placed his hand on Kang Tae-gon's shoulder and continued to say what he came here to say. Park Min-seok said that in this situation, he praised the guy for violating his order. The protagonist was very surprised by this, so he listened carefully to what the man would tell him next. Chief, let's continue to say that thanks to the guy entering the flames, the remains of the dead were preserved, and if he hadn't done this, his comrades would have turned to dust. That is why Park Min-seok, saddened by the loss, thanked the protagonist for his good work. Kang Tae-gon thanked the chief for these words, but he was not at all happy, because in one evening he lost two close comrades at once. After this, the fire chief looked at Cho Gyu-chang with displeasure. The guy immediately understood that I would not praise him now. The man said that the boy should learn patience. Cho Gyu-chang began to make excuses and say that the boss spoke in a very veiled manner, so he was not patient. Park Min-seok will continue to say that the guy was thick-skinned, so he didn't understand when he should intervene and when to keep quiet. Cho Gyu-chang asked the boss for forgiveness for this. After that, the protagonist timidly asked Park Min-seok if they could go see Chief Lee Chae-yeon and Sung-yu now. The fire chief nodded slightly and suggested that they go with him to say goodbye to the dead. Cho Gyu-chang asked if the protagonist would be okay, but despite everything, Kang Tae-gon decided that he had to be there now. Soon, Park Min-seok brought his subordinates to the right place, which was located in the same hospital where the main character ended up. Near office number 3, there was a wreath of white and yellow flowers, which indicated that this was the very place. The men in firefighter uniforms for the events who were already there were very surprised when they saw another person who had come to say goodbye to his fallen colleagues. Kang Tae-gon, who had not yet had time to change his clothes, took timid steps in hospital slippers. Cho Gyu-chang walked next to him and supported him. Our heroes walked slowly along a long corridor strewn with funeral wreaths. Despite the large number of people around, there was absolute silence. The protagonist's colleagues held back their emotions and tried not to look him in the eye so as not to embarrass him with their excessive attention. Cho Gyu-chang continued to lead the still weakened Kang Tae-gon forward, getting closer and closer to the right place. Soon the main character stopped and looked ahead with his tired eyes. In front of him, he saw portraits of his fallen comrades, which were strewn with white flowers. Kang Tae-gon silently looked at the photos of Chief Lee Chae-yeon and Sung-yu while collecting his thoughts. After this, the main character knelt before the altar and asked for forgiveness from his colleagues. The guy began to tremble with excitement, remembering everything that happened and trying to express all his thoughts in words. Clenching his fists tightly, Kang Tae-gon began to blame himself for the fact that he should have made more efforts to save his comrades. Suddenly, the main character interrupted his speech because he saw that someone stopped next to him. It was a little boy holding a toy fire truck in his hands. Kang Tae-gon looked at the child and it seemed that he recognized him from somewhere, although he had never met him in person before. The main character looked at the boy with a surprised look, who was quickly heading somewhere without letting go of the toy. Soon the child sat down next to an inconsolable woman who was apparently his mother. Kang Tae-gon immediately remembered that this child was called Maknae. This brought back some memories related to his fallen comrades. Chief Lee Chae-yeon showed a photo of that same boy on his phone and said that it was his son. When Kang Tae-gon and Sung-yu saw the child, they were very surprised and were sure that anyone who looked at this photo would say without a doubt that this was the boss's son. Lee Chae-yeon said that his boy had a dream of becoming a fireman because his dad was the coolest in the world. Sung-yu was sure that the man made the child dream of such a thing, but the boss denied it and said that his son would definitely become a judge or a doctor, but definitely not a fireman. Remembering this, the main character still could not believe that his comrades were dead. Unexpectedly, Kang Tae-gon placed his hands on the floor and bowed low to someone. The wife of the boss, Lee Chae-yeon, was very surprised to see this because she did not understand what the guy had planned. The main character bowed low to the woman and asked her for forgiveness. The woman immediately understood what the guy was asking for forgiveness for, but she was in no hurry to accept it. She asked the protagonist to stand up and said that it was not his fault, so he did not need to ask for forgiveness. After this, the woman looked at the portrait of her husband and continued to say that Kang Tae-gon entered that flame and pulled out his body. Therefore, the wife of the boss, Lee Chae-yeon, believed that it was she who should thank the main character. However, Kang Tae-gon did not agree with this and said that if he had tried a little more, this would not have happened. Suddenly, someone came up behind the main character and gently grabbed him by the shoulder. The guy looked to the side in surprise and saw an unfamiliar woman in front of him. She asked with a smile whether the guy was that same Kang Tae-gon. The woman said that she had heard a lot about him from her son and claimed that the main character was Sung-yu's favorite. From these words, Kang Tae-gon, holding back his emotions, began to tremble and try to say something, but the words became a lump in his grief from excitement. Unexpectedly, in order to calm the main character, the woman hugged him. The guy was surprised by this. After this, the woman began to cry and felt great regret about the death of her only son. The woman continued to say that her son was the best. At the same time, Kang Tae-gun was unbearably hurt by the fact that his friend's mother was crying because of his death. Continuing to hug the protagonist tightly, the woman suddenly thanked him. She thanked the guy for pulling her son out even in that condition. The woman also thanked him for protecting Sung-yu from the fire in this way at least. After this, Sung-yu's mother hugged the main character and tightly clenched her fists trying to cope with her emotions. Kang Tae-gun felt how bad the woman was, but he couldn't help her in any way because he himself was trying to restrain himself. Unexpectedly, the woman also thanked the main character for surviving. These words had a huge impact on Kang Tae-gun, after which he could no longer contain his emotions. The main character clenched his teeth tightly, but it didn't help, and so tears began to appear in his eyes. Chief Lee Chae-yeon's wife also began to cry. It was clear that her son, still a child, did not understand what was happening. Along the way, Kang Tae-gun asked everyone present to forgive him for not being able to save their comrades. Cho Ju-chang and Choi Chong-yun couldn't hold back their tears, but no one even thought about blaming the main character for anything. Chief Park Min-seok also gave vent to his emotions, but he couldn't show them to others, so he turned away. After this, Kang Tae-gun took Sung-kyu's mother's hand and asked her for forgiveness once again. The main character could no longer contain his emotions, so he began to cry heavily. Along the way, the guy said that he was really sorry that everything happened exactly like that. At that moment, Lee Chae-yeon and Sung-yu were closely watching everything that was happening in the room from their portraits. Surely, none of them condemned the main character either. Meanwhile, the chief's son was carefree playing with his toy fire truck, not yet understanding what was happening around him and why everyone was crying. It seemed that this child, despite everything, did not give up his dream and still wanted to become a firefighter like his father. The main character, after the farewell ceremony with his fallen comrades, remained in the hospital because he still needed to restore his health after the stress he had experienced. Kang Tae-gun sat alone on a bench in the hospital courtyard, silently thinking about something. The guy really wanted everything that happened to him and his comrades to be just an unpleasant dream. Suddenly, someone approached Kang Tae-gun from behind and placed a hand on his head. This momentarily confused the boy. It was Choi Chong-yun. Despite his comrade, he asked why the patient had not yet left. The man also said that he and their other colleagues would still be here, so the main character could not worry and return to his ward. Kang Tae-gun replied that he felt the time was good, so he did not need to return to the ward, and he wanted to stay here a little longer. Suddenly, several more colleagues approached the guy and asked the guy not to exhaust himself because he was not a machine. Kang Tae-gun replied that he simply felt heavy at heart for some reason. Seo Soo-yeon, hearing this, said that the guy shouldn't have said with such a face that everything was fine with him, and Pyo In-chul reminded the guy that the patient should have been lying in the ward. After that, Kang Tae-gun asked his comrades if it was okay that they came out to him. Pyo In-chul asked the guy not to worry because high-ranking officials had already come and left when there were few people. The main character, upon hearing this, immediately asked who the man was talking about. Pyo In-chul replied that he was talking about people from the top who only appeared in such situations. After receiving the answer, Kang Tae-gun said nothing more and continued to ponder his thoughts. Cho Gyu-chung assumed that there was chaos in the main character's head right now. The guy didn't deny it. Cho Gyu-chung understood his feelings because now everyone still couldn't comprehend the reality of what was happening. Unexpectedly, the guy said that before Sung-yu and Kang Tae-gun came to their team, their former boss also died while on duty. Also, Cho Gyu-chung decided to tell the reason why he was still here, since he saw where the funeral was. He recalled that at that time he was filled with emptiness and doubts. The guy immediately realized that the main character would be interested to know why he didn't change his profession to some other one. Unexpectedly, Choi Chong-yun answered this question and said that he himself wanted to know the answer. The man himself, like the rest of his colleagues, did not know the reason why he was still there, even though he had seen the death of his boss. After thinking for a moment, Kang Tae-gun asked if his comrade knew where to look for the answer to this question. Choi Chong-yun didn't know this, so he seriously asked what the main character thought about it. Kang Tae-gun replied that they all had to look for answers to their questions in places where their help was needed. The main character continues to say that the answer was always at the scene of the crime. They just didn't see it before. After this conversation, Kang Tae-gun returned to his hospital room, but without even turning on the light, he went to bed. The guy's official firefighting uniform was neatly folded and lying on the couch. In addition, all the few things of the main character, in which he was taken to the hospital directly from the scene of the incident, were carefully hung in the closet. Apart from hospital slippers, the only footwear the guy had here was his fire rubber boots, onto which the dim moonlight from the windows fell. Kang Taegon lay on the bed in the dark and thought about why he became a fireman, because before he had not really thought about it. Previously, the guy simply thought that he worked here to help people by putting out fires. The main character did not set any specific goal for himself when choosing this profession. He simply thought that this work was interesting to him and brought benefits to society. But this entire, less detailed image shattered into tiny pieces in just one day. It happened because of recent events. Then Kang Taegon realized that any day could be his last, and one day his turn would come to repeat the fate of Chief Lee Chaeyeon and Sung Yu. Kang Taegon still remembered well the horror that had gripped him at that moment. Because of this, he was already doubting the correctness of his choice. The main character lay on the bed and thought about the reason why he was still a fireman despite everything that had happened. The guy understood that the answer was always in plain sight, but now he couldn't see it, so he wanted to give up. Suddenly, the main character felt that he couldn't do this now. Kang Taegon didn't want to run away without finding the answer to this question. The clenched fist spoke of the determination of the guy who believed that everything could be found out by visiting the scene of the incident. The main character decided that he absolutely had to face this element again. Suddenly, the guy looked at his hand, which started to shake while he was thinking about all this. Then the main character realized with regret that his soul wanted this, but his body was very afraid. The thought of whether he would be able to return there greatly troubled Kang Taegon's mind. The main character understood that if he returned to this job and went on a call, he would have to enter the fire again. The memories of how he did it last time were completely unpleasant and frightening. The guy was also very scared by the thought of what would happen if the fire didn't let him go and he couldn't get out. Suddenly, the main character remembered his recent dream in which his boss, Lee Chaeyeon and Sung Yu burned right before his eyes. These memories haunted Kang Taegon for a long time, so much so that he even forgot that he needed to blink his eyes. For a long time, the main character lay in bed, unable to fall asleep despite the late hour. Soon the day of the funeral arrived. All the friends and relatives of the deceased gathered in one place. Several firefighters in official uniforms carried the coffin, which was draped in the South Korean flag. Another firefighter walked ahead carrying a photograph of Chief Lee Chaeyeon. A photo of Park Sung-gyu was also present at the farewell ceremony. Chief Park Min-seok loudly ordered all of his subordinates to salute, after which the firefighters as one raised their hand to their head. So Soo-yeon and Pyo and Chul, barely containing their emotions, were also present to see their comrades off on their final journey. Cho Gyo-chang and Choi Chong-yun were more reserved, but it was still clear that they regretted such a loss. Kang Taegon, despite the fact that he should have been in the hospital, was still present here to say goodbye to his close friends. A gentle, cool wind that suddenly blew seemed to carry the souls of the dead away with it. Some time passed. Despite the tragic incident during the mission, the fire department continued its work as usual. The common locker room was empty because almost everyone had already arrived for work. However, another firefighter had only just finished preparing and put on his work uniform. Judging by the name on the orange sweater, it was Kang Taegon. The main character, without hesitation, put on a cap with the emblem of the Republic of Korea Fire Service. After that, the guy closed his locker, which indicated that he was already ready to begin his work as a firefighter. Having gathered all his strength and concentrated, the main character ordered himself to go forward and not think about anything. The guy walked slowly towards the doors behind which his work began. At this time, the firefighters in the small office were resting and passing the time between calls by talking to each other or filling out reports. Suddenly, someone loudly greeted everyone present. The head of the first group of firefighters, Okwani, looked in surprise at the one who entered the room. This man continued to speak loudly and ask for forgiveness for his long absence. This surprised and attracted the attention of all the firefighters. The main character put his hand to his head and announced that the new recruit Kang Taegon had arrived for service. The guy insisted that he was back in action and could continue his work. After these words, absolute silence reigned in the room. Everyone was very surprised by the appearance of the main character. The guy's colleagues thought they were imagining things. They couldn't believe that he had returned. Kang Taegon stood there humbly, not even thinking of denying what had been said earlier. The men immediately thought that this was some kind of joke, because they did not understand since when it was so easy for the hospital to release those who almost went to the next world. Suddenly, someone put their hand on the main character's shoulder and at the same time asked their colleagues to be gentler with the guy. It was Okwani who reassured Kang Taegon and said that their comrades were simply greeting him with such words. Kang Taegon laughed good-naturedly and replied that he knew very well what his senior colleagues were like. Afterwards, the head of the 1st Fire Brigade asked if the boy was okay, and Kang Taegon confirmed it without a doubt. Then the man clarified that he was not asking about how the guy's body felt. This surprised the main character. After this, Okwani poked his finger into Contagon's chest and asked how he felt here. Contagon was very puzzled by the question that the chief of the 1st Fire Brigade, Okwani, asked him, and therefore for some time he could not give an intelligible answer. Still, the main character timidly, as if he was ashamed of this, said that inside he still had anxiety about what had happened. Okwani did not expect to receive a different answer from a guy who had experienced such a shock, and therefore said that of course it would not go away right away. In order to support his colleague, the man put his hand on his shoulder. Afterwards, Okwani's boss thanked the boy for not being hurt and congratulated him on his return to work. Contagon sincerely thanked the man for these words and for his support. Suddenly, the doors in the room began to open from that side, but because the guy was standing right in the passage, she hit him. From behind the door, the indignant voice of one of the firefighters was heard, who could not get inside and did not understand why the door did not open. Choi Chong-yun was surprised when he saw the main character and asked why he was standing at the door. Along with the man, other firefighters from the 2nd team also entered the room. Okwani was very surprised to see his colleagues and did not believe that the entire 2nd team came to work today. Contagon was very happy to see them all. The boss continued to be surprised because the men had been through a lot but were still eager to work. Choi Chong-yun replied that if they had rested, the other teams would have had more work. Immediately after this, another person entered the room unnoticed by the others present. It was Chief Park Min-seok who heard everything, and therefore assumed that it was the power of alcohol since everyone was so happy. Contagon and his comrades immediately saluted and put their hands to their heads when they saw their superiors suddenly appear. Park Min-seok said that he came to tell the 2nd Fire Brigade something, but he wanted to be brief. The man ordered the 2nd team to go out on the call, splitting into 2 and joining the 1st and 3rd teams. Everyone obeyed this without question. The fire chief also announced that they would soon appoint a new leader and that there would also be an increase in personnel. The man was sure that he also missed those who had left them only recently, but he believed that their places could not remain empty for long. Therefore, Park Min-seok suggested that all his subordinates treat each other with understanding. All the firefighters on the 2nd team unanimously agreed with these words. Park Min-seok continued to say that they all had a hard time, but he suggested enduring it with a smile on their face. The man believed that if they showed how they missed and were sad, then those who had passed away would not be able to leave this world peacefully. Contagon absolutely agreed with this and supported the chief. Finally, the man asked the 2nd team of firefighters to treat the newcomers well and show them how to work properly. Everyone immediately obeyed this order. When the boss left, Chief Okwani said that everything turned out as Choi Chong-yun had said earlier. Suddenly, the man put his hand on the main character's head and said that he would now be on his team. This surprised the guy very much. The boss warned everyone in advance that he would take Contagon on himself. Then Okwani looked menacingly at the main character and threatened that he would keep an eye on him, since he was already known to everyone for his excessive initiative. Contagon felt awkward about this and laughed politely and asked the man to take care of him. Then Choi Chong-yun asked the main character if he would feel okay in the 1st team. The guy replied that he didn't see any problem with it. After that, he decided that he would go to the 3rd team with So Soo-yeon and Pyo In-chul, and Cho Gyo-chang and the new guy would go to the 1st team. Everyone agreed with this. Then Choi Chong-yun suggested that they go on duty and finish the workday as soon as possible. The firefighters wished each other a good job. Walking to his workplace, Contagon noticed a bouquet of flowers lying on one of the tables. These were white chrysanthemums that lay on the workplace of one of those who died that fateful evening. The main character looked at these flowers and thought with regret that his life had become completely different. At the same time, the guy realized that everything around looked the same as before. Despite this, the main character felt that there was nothing left of his previous life. Chief Okwani saw that the boy was thinking and immediately understood what it was about. In order to help the main character, the man loudly addressed him. Contagon left all his thoughts and asked what happened. The head of the 1st team simply invited the guy to go with him and have coffee. Contagon agreed to this proposal without hesitation, just to distract himself from his thoughts. Soon the boss and his colleague were already in the break room getting coffee. Okwani asked if the guy was upset that his team split up. Contagon did not hide the fact that he was indeed a little upset about it. The man began to assure that there was nothing to regret because they all worked hard in the same office and were one family despite being divided into teams. The main character thought about these words and soon answered that he understood all this and agreed with it. Suddenly, the guy asked why the boss chose him for his team, Okwani replied that he did it because the guy was the most reckless of all. This answer really surprised Kang Taegon, who did not understand whether it was worth taking such a worker on. Then the chief of the first team of the town said that the main character looked like Lee Cheon, so he took him. Remembering his dead comrade with a smile, the man assumed that the guy already knew that Lee Cheon was very stubborn. Okwani also suggested that the protagonist's relationship with his boss was special, but he also worked with him for a long time. The man recalled that they had been together to various places where incidents had occurred, and together they had rejoiced at yet another victory and had barely escaped death. Okwani also recalled that they often argued because his colleague threw himself into the fire without thinking about himself at all. Nevertheless, he was his support and support. The man continued to say that when Sung-yu joined the team, he immediately saw that this guy looked like Lee Chaeon, just like the main character. It seemed that Kang Tae-gong was very pleased that the man compared him to his boss and Park Sung-yu, and so he thanked him for it. Okwani saw that his new subordinate felt much better, which could not but please him. However, the man said that he was seriously going to make the guy less reckless for his own good. Kang Tae-gong was surprised, because that was exactly why the boss took him into the team. Suddenly, a loud siren was heard from the speakers, announcing that the firefighters had work to do. Kang Tae-gong and Chief Lee Chae-yeon immediately stopped their conversation and began listening to the sound of the siren. The next moment, our heroes, without even finishing their coffee, rushed to the exit because they had to hurry. Running out into the corridor, Okwani loudly addressed his subordinates and said that they needed to hurry to the call. After this, the entire first team of firefighters, in an expanded composition, ran out of the room into the corridor. Continuing to run forward continuously, the main character suddenly fully realized what was happening right now meant to him in full. This realization terrified Kang Tae-gong, but he continued to run without stopping. The main character thought that he was returning to that fire again and exposing himself to great risk. The boy immediately saw a picture of a house engulfed in raging flames. Kang Tae-gong felt as if he was running into this flame completely unprotected. At that moment, the guy remembered what he had told Choi Chong-yun while sitting on a bench near the hospital, namely, that they should look for the answer at the scene of the incident. This memory gave the protagonist confidence. Now he thought that he couldn't just feel sorry for himself and constantly shake with fear. Kang Tae-gong firmly decided that he himself would find the answer to the question where his help was needed. Several fire trucks were racing along city roads, accompanied by loud sirens that alerted citizens to give way. The firefighters were in a great hurry to respond to the call because they could not lose a minute of precious time. Thick black smoke was already visible in the distance, which signaled that the rescuers should go in that direction. This time the fire broke out in a multi-story building that was still under construction. It was here that the firefighters were supposed to do their best work today. Soon the fire trucks were already at the scene. Very little time had passed since the call. Rescuers immediately began running out of their cars and preparing all the necessary equipment to extinguish the raging flames. The firefighters quickly went to their places. Each of them knew exactly what they had to do. Everyone worked quickly and hard, because each worker had learned this for a long time. Chief Okwani, checking his equipment, asked all his subordinates not to waste time and act faster. One of the men approached the chief and suggested that the fire had started on the 3rd floor. This same man also suggested that if they looked inside the building, they would definitely find out. The second firefighter, who was standing nearby, agreed with this. After this, the fireman asked his comrade to prepare the fire hose and make sure that it was long enough to reach the 3rd floor. At this time, Kang Tae-gong stood behind and could not take his eyes off the raging flames. This view gives the main character unpleasant memories of what recently happened to him. The guy looked at the black smoke coming out of the unfinished house, but saw the oil refinery engulfed in flames where his comrades had died. Still, Kang Tae-gong understood that his condition was abnormal for this situation, so he asked himself to calm down. After that, the guy looked at his left hand. As it turned out, it was shaking helplessly. Trying to somehow cope with this, the main character took his hand and exhaled heavily in order to calm down. Meanwhile, Okwani turned to the more experienced firefighters and said that they should take the firemen's hands and, taking the one in the middle, begin to extinguish the flames. After that, the boss turned to Kang Tae-gong and a guy named Kim Hoo-yeon and said that since they were new, they had to monitor the situation and eliminate risk factors. At this point, all the orders were given, so the boss asked all his subordinates to act quickly. Kim Hoo-yeon began to feel indignant that he had to be with the one who was causing the problems, and therefore decided that she advised him to say something to the main character. Soon the guy turned to Kang Tae-gong The main character looked at his partner with incomprehension, waiting for what he would tell him. Kim Hyo-yeon timidly asked the guy not to relax and be careful. Kang Tae-gun agreed with this without further ado, after which he handed his comrade a signal baton. The guy was surprised that the main character listened to him without any objections, and because of this, he was momentarily dumbfounded. Kang Tae-gun, let's continue saying that if the guy controls the situation, then he himself will handle the rest. Kim Hyo-yeon agreed with this. After that, the guy thought that it was a good plan, but he did not understand what he was actually supposed to do. At this time, a crowd of spectators had already gathered around the burning building attracted by this unusual event. To ensure that no one was hurt or that the firefighters were not prevented from doing their job, a fence was quickly erected with a warning that entry was prohibited. Kang Tae-gun humbly carried out his superior's order and made sure that people did not penetrate the fences, asking them to move away. People listened to the main character without any particular objections because they themselves understood that this was a very dangerous event. Kang Tae-gun thanked the people for their cooperation, but still continued to stand still and control the situation. Suddenly, an elderly man from the crowd turned to the guy and told him not to chatter, but rather to help put out the fire. Kang Tae-gun introduced himself and invited the old man to tell him about what was happening there and how their work was going. Suddenly, behind him, the main character heard the loud voices of his comrades asking to turn on the water. This attracted the attention of both the guy and the elderly man. They watched in admiration as rescuers used fire hoses to direct a powerful stream of water directly into the burning building. The power of this stream was enough for the water to reach the third floor without any problems. Kang Tae-gun began to tell the old man that they would first put out the fire, which was larger, and only then get inside. The guy wasn't exactly sure. He thought it shouldn't take long. Suddenly, several worried men ran to the fence and turned to the main character. The man desperately called the firemen, trying to get his attention because they wanted to tell him something. Soon Kang Tae-gun saw these men and was surprised by their persistence, not understanding what they wanted from him. Still, the main character approached them because he himself had questions. The guy asked the man if he knew those who worked on this construction site. One of the men confirmed this, but he didn't want to talk about that. The man was very nervous and therefore could not formulate his thoughts in order to tell the firemen everything. Kang Tae-gun tried to calm him down, saying that everything was fine and he could tell him everything. Suddenly, the second man started saying that one person who worked at that construction site was missing. The main character immediately asked if they had tried calling him. The man confirmed this. Even during this conversation, he held the phone in his hands, but no one picked up. Because of this, the men assumed the worst and were very sorry, because their friend had a 2-year-old son and a pregnant wife. Hearing all this, Kang Tae-gun was dumbfounded on the spot because he realized that the missing man was probably inside the burning building. The main character immediately jumped up, not believing that there really could be someone left inside the building. The guy ran forward, but in front of him he saw only a wall of flame, which this time he absolutely had to overcome. Kim Hyo-yeon saw his partner running somewhere and was very surprised by this. The guy asked Kang Tae-gun with confusion where he was running, but the guy ran past without explaining anything. After this, Kim Hyo-yeon saw a signal rod that was lying unattended on the ground and realized that the main character decided to do another job. Because of this time, he was not going to explain anything to anyone. Soon he was already running up to the entrance to the building, which his colleagues were right now putting out with a fire hose. Looking at the entrance, the main character was very happy that there was no flame visible in it, which meant his path was relatively safe. Now Kang Tae-gun definitely intended to quickly enter the building to check if there was anyone left inside. At this time, Chief Okwani, who was diligently supervising the firefighting, suddenly turned his attention to the entrance of the building to which one of his subordinates was running. The man immediately began to guess which of his subordinates it was and was therefore even more surprised. At this time, Kim Hyo-yeon ran up to the chief and reported that it was Kang Tae-gun. Hearing this, Okwani took his radio and loudly addressed the main character, asking where he was heading. Already climbing the stairs, the guy tried to calm the man up his old ways again. After this, the man turned to Kim Hyo-yeon and rudely asked why he didn't stop his partner. The guy could only ask for forgiveness for this. Then the angry boss ordered Kim Hyo-yeon to hurry up and go after Kang Tae-gun in order to catch him and bring him back. The guy obeyed without a... But first the guy stopped, leaning against the wall because he was tired from such an intense run in full firefighter gear. The main character looked around and was indignant that there was so much smoke here. The smoke was so thick and black that the guy couldn't even see his own hand. Still, the main character asked himself to calm down and first assess the situation around him. The guy understood that in order to come to his senses and do everything well, Khan Tegan was dumbfounded on the spot, apparently not expecting that there would be such a difficult situation inside the burning building. There was thick black smoke around the main character, which completely prevented him from seeing anything in front of him. Tegan's right hand began to tremble again, indicating that the young fireman was very afraid. The main character turned his head from side to side and did not understand what he was supposed to do in this situation. Suddenly, the guy had some strange feeling, thanks to which he understood what he had to do. Kang Taegun turned his head to the right to find some confirmation regarding his premonition. Having found nothing to your right, the guy immediately looked to the left, but this did not produce any results. Kang Taegun was indignant that he could not find anything, but at the same time he believed that this was not a simple premonition or assumption. This thought gave the guy confidence. Suddenly, Kang Taegun heard Kim Hoo-yeon's loud voice behind him, telling his boss that he was the victim. He first had to go through the fire. The main character saw that the flame was everywhere, but he noticed a place in the wall of fire where it was weaker. The young fireman assumed that this was the place where he would be able to pass through the fire and move forward. In order not to lose this moment, Kang Taegun floor, but they did not see where the main character was. The character now looked very similar to the deceased Lee Chae-yeon. This could not help but amaze the man. The fire peer watched as the main character fearlessly made his way through the wall of fire, completely unafraid of the raging tongues of flame around him. Kim Hoo-yeon and Chief Okwani were amazed by this sight. The chief began to doubt that the guy listened to him, even if he heard him. After this, the man grabbed his radio again and addressed Kang Taegun, ordering him to return back immediately. Kim Hoo-yeon finally realized that the protagonist heard them well, but deliberately did not follow their orders. Suddenly, the head of the first team jumped up and called the guy an idiot, afraid that he could get hurt because he wasn't even a professional. At this time, the main character had already run through the flames, after which it suddenly began to gradually subside. The situation was still very dangerous, and Kang Taegun could suffer serious harm if he made even the slightest mistake. Come to his senses. The guy was breathing heavily from fatigue while looking around intently. Kang Taegun, the boy, saw something strange in front of him. For some reason, the flame in front of him was behaving unnaturally. The main character felt as if something below the wall was absorbing the fire. Kang Taegun did not understand the reason for this and therefore asked himself to think about it carefully. At that moment, the guy heard his boss's voice on his radio, ordering his subordinates to quickly tie the fire hose to the ladder and go up to the third floor. The man also told everyone that Kang Taegun had jumped into the fire, so they needed to quickly go up to the floor with a fire hose. The guy immediately realized that when it was all over, he would receive punishment. Meanwhile, Kim Hoo-yeon and Okwani were crawling forward on their knees to get through the thick smoke. The guy asked if the boss was sure that there was an order for this. The man replied that he didn't know such a flame. The chief of the 1st Fire Brigade was of the same opinion. Meanwhile, Kang Taegun made his way further, making it difficult for the young firefighter to breathe. Kang Taegun was sweating from exhaustion, and at the same time, breathing heavily, the main character continued to make his way through the impenetrable thick smoke because he could not leave the victim here to certain death. The guy made his way forward on his haunches because there was less smoke below. Falling. Continuing to look around, Kang Taegun noticed the floor was so hot from the raging flames that it burned the protagonist's hands even through protective gloves. Suddenly, while making his way forward, the young fireman slightly hit his head on some obstacle. That is why, in such impenetrable smoke, it was necessary to crawl on his haunches. Kang Taegun immediately began to feel around, trying to determine what kind of obstacle was preventing him from going further. Posed a great danger to people who found themselves in a similar situation. Soon the main character realized that it was an iron table. The guy immediately wondered if he could save the victim from the heat and smoke for a short time. As soon as he had this question, Kang Taegun decided to immediately check it out, and therefore began to go around the suddenly appeared obstacle. In order to at least slightly improve his view, the main character turned on what he saw. As the main character expected, the man came to his senses and began to examine the victim, hoping that he was not too late. The guy immediately contacted his colleagues on the radio and reported that he had found a man in a burning house and was now checking his consciousness. The main character began to shake the injured man, trying to understand whether he was still alive. Suddenly, the room was filled with barely audible wheezing and coughing, which meant that the man was alive. Kang Taegun was overjoyed to learn this and immediately reported this good news over the radio. But he had to take conscious, but he did what the firefighter asked him to do. After that, the man began to cough, which was a good sign. Kang Taegun immediately informed the chief that the victim was alive, and they were now heading to a safe place. To do this, the guy threw the man onto his shoulder. Suddenly, the main character saw that there was much more black smoke around. Some of it even penetrated to work out and cough, asking the man to hold his breath, because the respirator he was wearing certainly couldn't handle it. Contagion continued to cough, thinking that if the smoke had already filled the room so much, then now he too was in danger. From the burning building with the injured Contagion, it was necessary to pass through the wall of raging flames again. The main character, he had to get out from where he came in. The guy had to squint because as he got closer and closer to the house, intending to lock him in this trap. However, Contagion did not think of giving up and only quickened his pace. The coveted exit was very close, but in order to receive this reward, one had to work hard first. The main enemy for the young fireman now was the fire, which only intensified as if realizing that the guy intended to get out of here. This frightened the main character very much, but he fought this feeling and loudly ordered the flame to disappear from his path. Suddenly, Contagion saw something in front of him that greatly alarmed him. There was something wrong with the fire. The raging flame that blocked the guy's path only grew stronger, as if trying to punish him for his insolence. Seeing this, the main character became indignant because the elements had become completely enraged and did not want to let him go. The guy thought that solving the problem that had arisen. The young fireman saw that on the path he was walking along there was almost nothing left that had started. What was left for Contagion now was to endure these grueling conditions and wait for the right moment. Soon the main character saw thick black smoke that suddenly appeared in the place where the flame had already burned out. The main character rushed from his place and ran towards the fire, which had become much smaller but remained just as dangerous. Coming ever closer, the young fireman grabbed the injured man more tightly, because now they had to perform a very dangerous action. The bright flames were already touching Cantagion's feet, but they could not stop his determination. Bright sparks of fire flew straight into the protagonist's face, but the protective mask successfully prevented escape from the shackles of flame. Fortunately, everything went very well. Suddenly, the main character saw a fireman in front of him, on whose protective suit bright orange stripes were visible. It was Chief Okwani, who could only now come to the rescue, having seen the following him for water. Contagion was very surprised when he heard this, because he did not understand why the man needed water now. This had to be done in order to prevent injuries in case the fire set fire to the firefighters' clothes. The chief immediately grabbed the radio and ordered his subordinates who were on the street near the fire trucks to stop supplying water. After that, the man rushed towards Contagion, calling him an idiot and asking if he was okay. Fortunately, everything was fine with the main character. He was already trying to get to his feet and was surprised by the sudden appearance of his boss. Okwani was very excited and asked what happened and why the boy climbed into the fire. Contagion suggested discussing all this later, since first it was necessary to help the injured man. The chief agreed with this. Okwani turned to Kim Huyan, who was standing nearby, and asked why he froze in place instead of helping. The guy immediately headed forward. Kim Huyan informed his boss that the man was already breathing much easier. Okwani did not understand what his subordinate was doing and ordered to quickly call the medics and provide them with passage. Meanwhile, Contagion sat to the side, trying to come to his senses, silently watching what was happening. It could be said that his work was done for today. The guy looked at the injured man whom he managed to find in this hell, and at his comrades who were helping him. This view calmed the main character, thanks to which he could now not worry about her and breathe a sigh of relief. Due to fatigue and stress, Contagion sat on the floor, lowered his head and tried to relax. Under the protective mask on the young fireman's face, one could see a smile because he was very happy that this time he managed to come to the rescue. While the main character was thinking about this, Kim Huyan was watching him closely from the side. The guy was very surprised by something and didn't understand whether it was an accident. Initially, he thought that Contagion was a walking problem who simply acted thoughtlessly. But at the same time, Kim Huyan was surprised that if someone could get hurt, the main character would be the first to come to the rescue, without even thinking about the consequences. The guy couldn't believe that Contagion rushed into the flames without thinking and found the victim, choosing the most optimal path as if he had already been in this place before. I think the guy couldn't figure out if it was just beginner's luck or talent. Kim Huyan continued to stare at the main character because his appearance reminded him of something. The guy thought that his colleague was very similar to his boss, Lee Chaeyeon, but in some ways they were still different from each other. It could be said of Lee Chaeyeon that he was a ghost of fire, who, with his experience and strength, fooled the flames, but Contagion was more like an animal that jumped into the very depths of danger. While the boy was pondering all this, Chief Okwani noticed his intent gaze at the main character. The man turned to Kim Huyan and asked what had happened to him. I assume he had lost the power of speech. This immediately distracted the guy from his thoughts. The boss continued to tell his subordinate that they still had a lot of things to do, so the guy needed to come to his senses immediately. Kim Hoo-yeon obeyed without objection and followed the chief of the 1st Fire Brigade. Finally, the boy couldn't help but look at Kang Tae-gun, still admiring his fearless act. Soon, thanks to hard work, the fire was extinguished. Only the black smoke that rose into the sky reminded of the recent tragedy. The injured man, who was saved by the main character, was quickly taken away by ambulance, which arrived immediately after the call was received. The work was finished for today, so the protective gear and oxygen mask were no longer needed by one of the firefighters and stood aside. Kang Tae-gun sat silently alone with his head down and tried to come to his senses after what had happened to him today. The main character thought carefully about what he could and couldn't do. I was able to do it. Unexpectedly, the young fireman smiled and thought that the words of Chief Lee Chae-yeon, who suddenly came to mind, were indeed true. The guy also remembered how a man asked him what reason there should be for people to save people. Now the main character knew the answer because he was able to save a man today by carrying him out of the fire. Kang Tae-gun couldn't help but be pleased that now he too could help someone. Thanks to these thoughts, the young fireman could now breathe a sigh of relief. The heavy stone that oppressed his soul finally slept. The protagonist was distracted from his thoughts by the voice of one of his colleagues, who was telling someone that the same firefighter was in that direction. Kang Tae-gun looked in surprise in the direction from which the voice came, not understanding who could need him now. Suddenly, the same man who had recently told him that there was a victim in the hot building appeared in front of the guy. There was another old man with him. The seemingly shocked old man did not say a word and began to approach the main character, putting his hands forward. Kang Tae-gun looked at this unfamiliar man in surprise, not understanding what was going on. The next moment, the older man grabbed the boy by the shoulder and bowed slightly in front of him. This only made Kang Tae-gun's surprise even greater. The old man was unable to contain his emotions and sincerely thanked the protagonist. The young fireman still did not understand who this old man was, who had suddenly appeared, and tearfully thanked him for nothing. The man who came with the old man explained that he was Mr. Park's older brother, but this information did not help Kang Tae-gun understand what was happening here. The man saw the boy's bewilderment and added that it was the brother of the man recently saved by the main character. The man also said with a smile that Mr. Park had talked to his brother before he was taken away by ambulance and told him everything. Hearing this, Kang Tae-gun asked if the old man should have followed the injured man to the hospital. The man replied that Mr. Park's wife had sent him there. Meanwhile, the old man continued to hug the main character and cry, which made the guy feel awkward, so all he could say was that he was glad that he could help. Having calmed down a little, Kang Tae-gun let the old man go, but in return he took his hand because she still wanted to tell him something. The elderly man, with tears in his eyes, said that he did not know how to thank the young firefighter for his help. Embarrassed, Kang Tae-gun, without asking for anything in return, said that it was just his job. There was an awkward moment of silence after that, during which the sad man looked at the fireman's hands. The old man saw that the boy's clothes were burnt and immediately realized that he had risked his life to save his younger brother. Kang Tae-gun, however, did not respond because he really was putting his life in danger in this job. After this, the old man began to ask how he could thank the guy. The main character asked the old man not to rush with this because it was still unknown what condition his brother was in. To this, the old man, wiping away his tears, replied that his brother looked good and told him that a fireman had saved him by walking through the fire. Looking around, the elderly man continued to say that these were not just words and he had to do something for the main character. Hearing this, Kang Tae-gun began to deny it and say that he didn't need anything. However, the old man insisted that the young fireman had saved his only brother and he could not help but thank him for it. The main character became confident that the sincere words of the elderly man were enough for him. The old man was very persistent, so he kept saying that he had to do something and asked the guy not to refuse him right away, but to think about his feelings too. Kang Tae-gun felt very awkward listening to all this, because he didn't know how he should behave in this situation. Suddenly, the guy pretended that someone was calling him, so he immediately raised his hand up and shouted loudly that he was walking here. Then the guy pretended that someone had called him to come over to him urgently. Immediately after this, Kang Tae-gun jumped up and ran forward, saying that his boss had called him, so he had to leave. The man and the old man were very surprised and could only watch the young fireman running away from them. However, they realized that the main character lied to them in order to avoid continuing the conversation. Meanwhile, Kang Tae-gun tried to run as far as he could with all his might, so that the people's excessive gratitude would not overtake him. For some time, the guy continued to run along the way, trying to find a secluded place where no one would disturb him. Gradually, he began to slow down from fatigue, but continued to move forward. Soon the main character turned around to make sure that no one was following him. Only after this could the young fire stop and breathe a sigh of relief. After this, the guy returned to the thoughts that had been troubling him for a long time. Kang Tae-gun thought that this work was just a profession for him. In this job, he performed his duties and received a salary. But at times like now, it was something more. The guy felt some unusual feeling inside himself that he could not feel in ordinary life. These feelings slightly disturbed the main character, but were pleasant. It was a feeling of calm and peace that came from the soul itself, as if he was exactly where he was supposed to be and doing what was needed. This feeling gave the main character confidence in the correctness of his actions. Thanks to this feeling, Kang Tae-gun diligently carried out his duties, sparing no effort and exposing himself to danger every time. Meanwhile, firefighters continued their work. Chief Okwani said that even if there were no casualties, they still had to find out what happened. The man also suggested putting everything out quickly and returning. His subordinates supported this idea, and so continued to pour water from the fire hydrant into the fire. In addition, they diligently extinguished all the coals so that they would not cause a new fire. The work continued for some time. The chief loudly asked his subordinates not to leave a single spark. Soon Okwani turned to the less experienced firefighters and asked them to pack up their gear and prepare to return. This also applied to Kang Tae-gun. The firefighters immediately began to carry out this order. One of the fire hoses was already neatly folded and the water tap was turned off. One of the men was humming a simple song under his breath, very pleased that his working day was already ending. All the firefighters were smiling because they were happy that they had managed to carry out their duties and no one was hurt. At this point, one could confidently say that the rescuers' working day had been successfully completed. Very soon, everyone returned to the fire department where they could rest and come to their senses. The first thing the rescuers had to do was wash themselves and wash their hands, because their work was not at all clean. Kang Tae-gun stood in front of the mirror, smiling and tidying himself up. Soon the thoughts that had been troubling him for a long time again filled his mind. The guy looked at his reflection in the mirror and couldn't stop thinking about the flame. The young fireman was very keen to know why, at that crucial moment, he was suddenly able to see the direction of the smoke. Kang Tae-gun began to fear that he might already be going crazy. Thinking about what it was, the main character began to go about his business. Kang Tae-gun walked out into the corridor, not even suspecting what would happen right now. In the corridor, the guy saw two of his colleagues who turned to him. The young fireman immediately realized that all this was not good for him. Soon all three approached the restroom so that no one would disturb their conversation. Suddenly, the door to the room opened sharply and hit the wall, causing the crash to echo throughout the entire corridor. After this, someone roughly dragged the main character into the room, and along the way they said that they needed to talk about something. Kang Tae-gun was shocked and did not understand what he had done to deserve such treatment. Following the guy into the break room, Chief Okwani and Cho Gyu-chung entered, and judging by the expressions on their faces, they were very unhappy about something. So that no one would interfere with the private conversation, Cho Gyu-chung closed the doors to the restroom, not letting anyone in. Chief Okwani stared at the protagonist for a moment with a dissatisfied expression. Cho Gyu-chung also didn't come here just to have a friendly chat with Kang Tae-gun. The main character was very surprised by what was happening and did not ask why his comrades were looking at him like that. Finally, Chief Okwani, trying to contain his anger, began to speak. The man, without taking his eyes off Kang Tae-gun, asked if he had gone crazy. The main character immediately began to deny this. Then Okwani rudely asked why, in that case, the guy jumped into the fire as soon as he returned from the hospital. Kang Tae-gun didn't understand what he did wrong, so he just silently looked at his boss. The man continued to ask whether the guy really thought that someone who hadn't even received a badge with his name on it should have acted like that. Kang Tae-gun immediately asked for forgiveness, but this did not calm down Chief Okwani at all. He unexpectedly clenched his fist and decided to demonstrate what would happen if the guy continued to behave like this. The next moment, the man hit the wall with all his might, asking at the same time whether the main character would act as he did today. After that, it was Cho Gyu-chung's turn to talk to his colleague, while the boss was on the sidelines coming to his senses. The guy asked if Kang Tae-gun was trying to kill himself with his antics. Cho Gyu-chung was very angry and kept asking why the protagonist threw himself into the blazing flames. Kang Tae-gun silently endured all these claims without explaining anything. This silence made Cho Gyu-chung even more angry, so he undoubtedly grabbed the protagonist's clothes roughly. After this, the guy demanded that the main character look him in the eye and answer his questions. Although Kang Tae-gun was scared, he remained silent because he did not know how to explain his actions more clearly. Chief Okwani was very surprised when he heard the loud screams of his subordinate and from this, he even instantly calmed down and came to his senses. Cho Gyo-chung continued to hold the protagonist by his clothes and loudly asked if he would do this if he didn't want to die. Okwani saw that the guy was too angry and therefore intervened in order to prevent a fight from starting. The boss took the Cho Gyo-chung realized his mistake and began to regret what he had done, which was evident from his face. The boss also said that if the guy couldn't control himself, he should have left or stood behind him. Cho Gyo-chung did not respond to this, but he was not going to leave either, which meant he agreed with Okwani's words. The boss understood the feelings of his subordinate and therefore could not punish him, but he also could not stand in the way of such emotional behavior. Suddenly, Kan Taegun began to loudly say that the Migo had attracted Okwani's attention. Having plucked up his courage, the main character first apologized but then said that he had not done anything wrong today. The man thought that the guy was talking nonsense and looked like a drunk driver who was barely speaking and trying to convince everyone that he hadn't been drinking. Kang Taegun agreed that he was guilty of disobeying his superior's order, but he saved a man, which completely justified his actions. It was hard to argue with Kwani, so for now he just stared straight into the protagonist's eyes. Cho Gyo-chung also didn't know what to answer to this because on the one hand, Kang Taegun was of course right. Soon, Okwani asked if the guy would jump into the fire again. The protagonist confidently answered that if someone remained in the power of the flames, then they had to help because it was their job. These words greatly angered Cho Gyo-chung, so he again called his colleague a stupid child. Then the head of the first fire brigade asked if Kang Taegun really thought that he would always be okay after this and not get hurt. Having received no answer, the man asked again whether the boy really hoped that he would always emerge from the flames alive. Kang Taegun timidly replied that no one had given him such a guarantee. Hearing this, Okwani rudely asked what the young fireman was thinking about in that case. The man began to lose control of himself from anger and called the main character an idiot and asked him if he really considered himself a ghost of fire like Lee Chae-yeon. After this, Chief Okwani fell silent so as not to say any more unnecessary things. The tightly clenched fist indicated that the man was still very angry and was trying to contain his emotions. At this time, Kang Taegun was thinking about why the boss compared him to a fire ghost. Suddenly, the guy heard the voice of a man who asked him to come to his senses because only Lee Chae-yeon did such things. These words shocked the main character. Kang Taegun immediately remembered his previous boss. It was he who everyone called the Ghost of Fire because of his fearlessness. Kang Taegun wondered whether Okwani had made this comparison by accident or whether he actually had a reason for it. The main character began to remember how he felt while in a building engulfed in flames. These memories shocked the young fireman, but also led him to new thoughts and careful reflection. Kang Taegun could not answer Chief Okwani, who still continued. The man asked the main character not to rush, because he would still have many opportunities. The guy remembered his previous boss, Lee Chae-yeon, and thought that perhaps what he felt was not his, but someone else's experience. Suddenly, the protagonist, however, no matter how much he told himself this, he could not deny the fact that at that moment in the burning building, he really understood fire. Chief Lee Chae-yeon had really been passed on to him or not. Leaving the restroom, the main character finally decided that he would check this directly during the next call. The young fireman believed that if this was really the case, he would definitely be able to escape the flames, saving someone's life in the process. Soon, firefighters and medics were on another call to put out the flames and save people. Okwani knew how stubborn Kang Taegun was, so he tried to control him, but now he didn't see him, which made him worried. The boss looked around and loudly asked where the guy. Okwani couldn't believe that the main character did it again and ordered Kim Hoo-yeon to quickly go and help him. Character a lesson if he did something like that again. Some time passed. During another, the man immediately assumed that the main character had entered the burning building again without his permission. The next moment, the chief's guess was confirmed as soon as he looked to the side. Kang Taegun, unharmed, led the injured girl. As soon as the firefighters arrived on the next call, Chief roped to his hand, saying that this was the boy's punishment for his disobedience. Kang Taegun threatened that he would remember this. Our heroes made their way into the hot building together. Along the way, Okwani asked the protagonist to think a little about his colleagues who were worried about him. The man crawled forward through the smoke-filled room and continued to say that everyone was afraid that the guy would get hurt, looking at how he acted. After this, the boss asked if the main character understood what he was telling him. There was no answer, which made Okwani wary. Stopping and turning back, the man did not see Kang Taegun, who was supposed to be following him, so he pulled the rope hard to check if everything was okay, and had intentionally tied a tool for extinguishing coals to the rope instead of him through the thick smoke on his own. The guy mentally apologized to his boss, but he couldn't do otherwise. The main character, looking for something in the smoke, believed that he had to check his guess of black smoke and already understood that his guess was correct because he saw everything. The guy clearly saw the black smoke in front of him that was enveloping the firefighters. The main character also saw raging tongues of flame that devoured everything in their path. Now, however, Contegan was absolutely sure that he had not imagined it last time. The guy immediately pointed his finger forward. Contegan was walking towards the man, leading next to him the victim he had just saved. The main character was breathing heavily from fatigue and staring straight into the eyes of his boss, but also smirked. There was a sign on the wall warning of danger and asking people not to approach. One of the men was here with the others. Kim Hyun was also present, but he was not so determined. Meanwhile, the tension grew. It seemed that each of these men wanted to begin. Suddenly, one of the men began to tremble, clenching his teeth tightly as if from anger, because the fire could kill him. Cho Gyu-chang said without exaggeration that they all went crazy when they looked at Kang Tae-gon and what he did at the crime scenes. The main character didn't respond to this, but he breathed a sigh of relief because he expected something completely different. Soon the firefighters' working day was over, so everyone took off their work uniforms and went out into the busy streets of the city, especially since their senior colleagues were paying for everything. I poured the main character another glass of alcohol. His friend asked the guy to forget about his troubles. After this, another glass of alcohol followed, along with which someone said that the living should live, because then the dead would rejoice. While pouring another glass for the already drunk Contegan, someone said that the guy would definitely recover tomorrow without any incidents. These festivities continued until late at night until all the men went home. His comrades were already completely desperate and therefore only silently followed him with their eyes. Soon the main character took off his protective helmet and put it aside because, as he believed, his work here was finished. Main character try to talk to him again. Cho Gyu-chang turned to the boy and asked how long he was going to continue doing this. The second fireman thought that it was time for the main character to stop and therefore threatened that if he did not stop, he would not go on any more calls. Cho Gyu-chang adjusted his glasses with a serious expression and said that their silence did not mean that his colleagues were not worried about the guy. Kang Tae-gon did not react to these words in any way and continued to sit silently in place with his head bowed down. Suddenly, the main character straightened up sharply and looked at his comrades. A sincere smile shone on his face. Once again, making his could not keep up with, no matter how hard he tried, passed on to him. The young firefighter was worried about whether his colleagues would believe him if he told them everything. The guy thought about this, and after work he returned home. He believed that other firefighters would definitely consider him crazy. A quiet summer morning arrived. The cloudy sky warned the townspeople that rain was coming. Someone was walking along the quiet and still deserted streets. It was Contegan, who, as usual, was leisurely walking to work, completely immersed in his thoughts. The main character thought about the knowledge he received from his boss, Lee Chaeyeon. The guy assumed that perhaps he possessed this gift temporarily, since no one knew for sure whether this knowledge would disappear tomorrow. The protagonist continued to think that if he relied only on this gift, did not suit the guy at all. He wanted to move on because he believed that if he stopped, he would fall behind. Hyun approached the boss and asked what he was looking for. The man immediately asked the boy if he knew where Kang Tae-gon was. Kim Hyun replied that he knew about it. For some time, the boss silently looked at his subordinate, expecting to receive an answer from him, but there was no answer. Unable to bear this expectation of yours, Okwani's group asked the guy turned out. In the backyard, there really was firefighters' equipment laid out on the asphalt. In addition, there was a telephone with a stopwatch turned on the boxes. Kang Tae-gon was ready to press the start button, while thinking that his goal was to repeat everything 1,000 times and improve his time to 1 minute and 20 seconds. The main character pressed the button, after which the stopwatch began its count. Once Kang Tae-gon asked Lee Chaeyeon why it was necessary to learn to put on the equipment so quickly, because the main character or someone else's life might depend on this, so it was necessary to always be ready and quick. The main character believed that the boss was deceiving him and that he just wanted to torment the newcomers. The man laughed at this. After that, Lee Chaeyeon asked the newbie to remember that if he were to his boss because he had never even thought about this before. The man continued to say that this saved time was intended to more quickly extinguish the fire and rescue the victims. Kang Tae-gon thought about these words and admitted that the man was right about this. Then the main character said that he understood what his boss was telling him. Later, through tears, it is better to prepare in advance with a smile on your face. These memories took the main character time that the stopwatch had already counted, so the guy had to start all over again. After this, the young fireman slapped himself hard across the cheeks in order to come to his senses and concentrate on his task. As soon as the main character was ready, he exhaled and started the stopwatch. The next moment, the guy quickly jumped into rubber boots and quickly pulled on protective firefighter pants. Soon, Contagon was already putting an oxygen bag on his back. The final step was to put the protective mask on the face and secure it correctly. It didn't take long before Contagon was already fully dressed in his gear. After this, the main character looked at the stopwatch in the hope of seeing acceptable numbers on the 1 minute and 32 seconds, but the main character thought that it was slow for him. Taking off his equipment, Contagon began from the very beginning again. Soon all the equipment was back on Contagon. All that was left was to look at the stopwatch. The result improved slightly. The stopwatch showed that everything took the guy 1 minute and 27 seconds. But this was an unacceptable. In order to repeat his training, the guy began to take off his equipment again, thinking along the way that before it seemed to him that all this would be easier. Soon the protagonist started the stopwatch again and repeated everything from beginning to end. This time turned out to be the most unsuccessful for Contagon, since he spent 1 minute and 35 seconds on this attempt. Suit in place, Contagon anticipated that a long journey still awaited him. He considered himself pathetic. Wiping the sweat from his forehead, Contagon prepared to make another attempt to reach an acceptable time. After this, long hours of training followed, with difficulty moving his legs, trembling from fatigue. To him, hearing the familiar voice, Contagon immediately turned around and looked at his. Contagon immediately began to deny this, saying that he was completely fine, and to prove these words, the guy jumped high into the air. Chief Okwani looked intently at the protagonist, guessing that he was away. Nevertheless, the boss and his subordinates said goodbye and went about their business. After this, the young fireman continued to slowly descend the stairs, holding back the severe pain that penetrated all his muscles. It was only at this late hour that Contagon left the fire station and headed home. Standing at the crosswalk and waiting for the traffic light was unbearably long and painful for the main character. Trying not to pay attention to what his body was feeling now, the guy with a dissatisfied face thought about whether he had a healing ointment at home. Suddenly, Contagon's stomach screamed loudly because the guy was hungry. This sound immediately attracted the attention of the people around a 24-hour restaurant that served delicious hangover soup. The main character was very exhausted from today's training, but at the same time he had no appetite at all. Still, the young fireman thought that if he ate, he might gain strength, so he decided to go to a restaurant. The next day arrived. The rays, giving the city dwellers the opportunity to wake up from a long sleep. Despite the early hour, the fire department was already in full swing, as accidents could happen at any moment. The firefighters passed the time in the office, chatting with each other and filling out reports. Not all firefighters were spending time in the office. Contagon on the full firefighter's gear several times, and it seemed that it was getting better each time. The guy's enthusiasm quickly evaporated when he saw Contagon's flashlight lying train even more, using all his free time. The young fireman immediately began to repeat his training. The equipment was already ready and neatly laid out in front of the guy. The next moment, the stopwatch started counting down, which meant Contagon had to hurry. Over these few days, the main character repeated the same actions many times, so they became more coordinated and clear. It seemed that the young firefighter would soon succeed in achieving his goal and meeting his deadline. However, the guy failed again. He lacked just a little bit of speed to finally improve his result, so he immediately decided to repeat everything from the very beginning. Currently doing their job. However, the fire department was not empty because the other firefighters were still on duty. At least one fireman could always be found in the office. Kim Hyun was also there, holding a box of cookies in his hands and already getting ready to leave somewhere. The boy turned to Chief Okwani and told him that he was going to go to Contagon and so he could give him something from him. The man refused this and asked Kim Hyun not to distract the main character from his training. The guy assured that he himself understood this. Suddenly, the boss asked his subordinate to wait because he wanted to tell Contagon something. All the firefighters who were in the office were closely watching this conversation. The next moment, Chief Okwani gave his subordinate a can of coffee and asked him to give it to the main character. Cho Gyu-chung immediately supported this initiative and asked his colleague to give Contagon a small gift from him as well. After that, everyone present in the office asked Kim Hyun to pass on their treats to the guy as well. Soon, Kim Hyun had a small pile of various drinks and sweets in her hands that were intended for the main character. At this time, Contagon took a short break from his training in order to rest and get himself in order. The exhausted guy was breathing heavily from fatigue, but he didn't even think about ending his practice there. The sweat-soaked t-shirt on the main character indicated that he was putting absolutely all his efforts into achieving his goal. Despite this, the guy still couldn't put on the equipment within the limited time, so he thought he hadn't practiced enough. Returning to the backyard of the fire department, the main character was very surprised by such an unexpected gift. He doesn't know who exactly put these sweets here, but he was sure that all his colleagues had a hand in it. Thanks to this sign of attention, Kang Tae-gun was once again offended by the fact that his colleagues only wished him well. The next fireman was confident that he would succeed because he could not let his comrades down. At this time, someone was closely watching the main character from one of the windows of the fire department. It was Chief Lee Chae-yeon and Cho Gyu-chang who had long ago set themselves the goal of keeping an eye on the main character. Cho Gyu-chang was afraid that his colleague might be overworked because he was trying his best. Cho Gyu-chang calmly replied that he knew why the guy was doing this and therefore could not stop him. Taking a small sip of coffee, Okwani guessed that the main character became like this because of Lee Chae-yeon's boss. Cho Gyu-chang did not give in to arguing with this and will only briefly suggest what could have happened in reality. Unexpectedly, Okwani asked his subordinate if he missed his previous boss. Cho Gyu-chang thoughtfully confirmed this and said that all the workers of this fire department missed the deceased man. Okwani asked the boy to be patient because death always wandered near the firefighters. Cho Gyu-chang agreed with this, but did not try to be modest and therefore said that he simply grasped everything on the fly. After that, Cho Gyu-chang looked out the window again and said that the main character could still train because so hard now. Okwani recalled that during recent challenges, the protagonist could barely drag his feet due to muscle pain. However, which he managed to do very quickly. The final stage was the protective mask, which still had to be tightly fixed on the head. A moment later, the young fireman, fully dressed in his gear, was already standing with his back straight and recording the time he had spent on this. At that very moment, the guy heard the howl of an alarm. Kang Tae-gun looked in surprise in the direction from which the loud sound came, not believing in such coincidences. Soon, Chief Okwani loudly announced to his subordinates that they should rush to the call. The firefighters immediately ran to their vehicles. The chief asked his comrades not to panic and to act judiciously but quickly. Not much time passed, but the firefighters were already jumping into the fire trucks. One of the members of the 1st Fire Brigade turned to Kim Hoo-yeon and asked where Kang Tae-gun was. The guy decided to immediately save him, asked his colleagues if they had really seen a ghost. The man replied that he would have been much less scared and surprised if he had seen a ghost. After this, the main character pretended to be unperturbed, as if he did not understand at all what had caused such a violent reaction in his colleague. Kim Yoo-jong, walking to his seat, looked at Kang Tae-gun again, silently surprised by his diligence. Shortly after, several fire trucks, accompanied by loud sirens, drove out onto the city streets in order to arrive at the scene as quickly as possible. Thanked them for their good work today. Despite this, Cho Gyu-chang, judging by his facial expressions, of the guy who did it again. The men from the 1st Fire Brigade looked intently at one of their colleagues, not hiding their displeasure. And his personal belongings were kept. The young fireman checked the condition of his oxygen tank, which was completely empty after today's call. The guy was pleased that all his equipment was in order. The main character also didn't forget to charge his flash. The guy was shocked by this unexpectedness. Kang Tae-gun was thrown to the side and hit hard against an iron locker for the worker's personal belongings. Okwani rudely addressed the guy and asked what he was doing again and why he was being a hero again. Cho Gyu-chang was there with the boss. A shocked Kang Tae-gun looked at his colleagues. This explanation did not at all convince Okwani, who remained just as angry. The boss asked the guy if he really thought that he was the only firefighter, to which he immediately received a negative answer. Then the man asked why, in that case, the main character acted alone. At the same time, the boss was surprised that the main character, Kang Tae-gun, calmly replied that if he had acted according to all the rules, the victim could have died. This made the man even more angry, and he looked away, trying to find the right words. However, the head of the 1st Fire Brigade said that the main character was an idiot anyway. After this, the man asked if the boy really thought that he was immortal. Kang Tae-gun calmly did not understand what was the reason for such behavior of his subordinate. The protagonist briefly explained that he was lonely, his shoulder to encourage him, and his words sounded more heartfelt. However, Kang Tae-gun began to say that he wanted to save the people his loved ones needed. In addition, he did not want to regret it later. Frowning in displeasure, Chief Okwani said that the protagonist could not have done such a thing. The young fireman continued to insist on his own and say that he could and would do so as long as he had the strength. Committed even one more such offense. Kang Tae-gun only remained silent, and demanded that his subordinate give him his answer and say that he understood everything. Kang Tegan was also already angry, so he rudely said that he could not give such an answer to his boss. The guy continued to fearlessly tell the man that he could not leave the victim in the fire no matter when or where. The main character knew perfectly well what answer Okwani wanted to hear from him, but he did not want to deceive him and therefore could not give it. The head of the 1st Fire Brigade became so angry at what he heard that he could no longer speak, but only shook with rage, clenching his teeth. Still, the man retreated, indignant at how stubborn his subordinate was. After this, Chief Okwani left the guy and began to leave. Kang Tae-gun was pleased that he was able to defend his position. Cho Gyu-chang followed the man because he also didn't know what he should say to the main character in order to convince him. The boss and his subordinate Walker had no intention of stopping. Still irritated, Okwani knew this very well. The boss's worries about Okwani and the main character were due to the fact that the guy was doing really dangerous things. Nevertheless, Kang Tae-gun could still come to his senses on his own. After this, the head of the 1st Fire Brigade left his subordinate alone with his thoughts. The guy thought about what else he could have said to Kang Tae-gun to convince him, and also about what was the reason for his defiant behavior. Besides everything else, Cho Gyu-chang was worried that at this rate the main character could simply be fired, and then their team would lose an excellent rescuer. Some time passed. Night fell. Only the lamppost served as a source of light in this impenetrable darkness. In the small apartment on the ground floor, the light was no longer on. One could assume that its owner was already asleep. The dim light from the street barely penetrated the room and fell on the shabby table. The bed was already made up but empty. The owner of the apartment was clearly not asleep yet. The young man bowed his head down, clasping it with his hands. It was Kang Tae-gun who was sitting silently on the floor in the corner of the dim room, thinking about something. These thoughts were not pleasant because they made the guy very nervous and his body trembled. After some time, the long night finally ended. A new clear day arrived. Bright rays of sun penetrated into the small room, making it no longer seem so gloomy. The calendar that stood on the table indicated that today was Kang Tae-gun's only day off. The main character was still asleep, because the thoughts that had been troubling his mind had not left him for a long time the previous night. However, Kang Tae-gun should have already prostrated himself, because the phone that suddenly started ringing indicated that someone wanted to talk to him. The main character heard this ringing well, but was in no hurry to pick up the phone, trying to come to his senses after a short sleep. Still, the guy picked up the phone and saw that his older brother had called him. Kang Tae-gun was very surprised by the sudden morning call, but answered for a long time. The main character explained that today was his day off and he was sleeping. The guy in the business white shirt. The main character asked if the elder of the Kang family had any business with him. Kang Tae-yong assumed that this was his brother's way of showing his character. Rubbing his eyes, Kang Tae-gun calmly asked why her interlocutor had called him. Kang Tae-yong replied that he called to ask for money. The main character clearly didn't like this answer. The guy immediately refused this request and said that he would hang up. Kang Tae-yong was stunned and tried to stop his brother. The guy asked in an excited voice if he couldn't ask his brother for some money, to which he immediately received a categorical and negative answer. Then Kang Tae-yong asked if the main character hadn't seen the price of the trip. He reminded them that it was their parents. That Kang Tae-yong asked the guy if he would mind having a drink with him when he was free. This question really surprised the main character. It was really strange because the brothers usually fought with each other, and so such a proposal sent a company and had greatly improved his skills. The main character no longer wanted to continue the conversation, so he began to say goodbye to his brother. Kang Tae-yong asked the guy to call home because he had not spoken to his parents for a long time. It seemed that the main character didn't really like this idea, so he suggested that his brother do it, but he insisted that Kang Tae-gun call. The main character replied that his brother also didn't call his parents often. After that, he reminded me that the year before last, when his girlfriend Kang Tae-yeon left him, he suffered so much that he forgot about his beloved parents. Kang Tae-yong really didn't like these words, so he demanded that the main character shut up, while saying that he had wanted to continue the conversation, so he hung up. Kang Tae-gun was indignant that every time his brother called him, he called him an idiot, as if he were some kind of person. After this, the main character began to think whether he should have sent up the phone and began to search for the desired number in his contact list. Finally, the main character put the phone to his ear and began to listen to the beeps, waiting for his call to be answered. Soon, but understood that this was what happened when a person worked. After this, the woman asked if everything was okay with her son. Kang Tae-gun replied that everything was fine with. Suddenly, the main character's mother began to ask a question but stopped, thinking that she shouldn't have done it. Kang Tae-gun understood what she wanted to ask him, so he replied that everything was fine and everything worked out for him. The woman was glad to hear this, and also noticed that the main character began to speak more confidently. The guy was surprised by this. After this, the main character's mother told him to go and have breakfast here. He had just woken. It seemed that the main character was not very happy with this conversation because he was not able to say everything. Soon the guy looked around with an unenthusiastic look, not knowing what he was supposed to do on this day off. On one side of the room, the main character saw unwashed dishes and scattered things. On the other side, there were dirty clothes and unnecessary boxes with other trash scattered around. Looking at all this, the main character's mood did not improve at all. Still, Kantigan decided that he should eat first, so he began to stand up. Routine tasks began that absolutely had to be done. First, the guy started with washing the dishes. Soon it was time to thoroughly wash the floor and clean the apartment. Kantigan did not forget about the garbage, which he threw away, albeit without pleasure. Kantigan himself was surprised by this because it was so clean here, as if it was not he but someone else who lived in this house. After this, the young firefighter was able to take a short break and rest while sitting on the bed. Suddenly, the guy received another call on his phone, which did not allow him. A girl named Jong Yeon-mi persistently tried to call Kantigan. Nevertheless, the main character resigned himself and answered the call, putting the phone to his ear. Kantigan greeted the girl. The cheerful voice on this end immediately noted that the guy was quite cheerful. The main character agreed with this because he had already woken up a long time ago. After that, he asked if the girl was already in front of the house. Jong Yeon-mi confirmed this. Then Kantigan asked how she knew his address and assumed that the fire department told her about it. The girl reminded that the main character himself told her where he lived. Kantigan did not see any problem with this and was already opening the door for her. After that, the main characters went out in reverse to meet Jong Yeon-mi. The girl was already going down the stairs and was momentarily taken aback when she met the guy's gaze. Seeing her, Kantigan greeted the girl with an awkward greeting. Jong Yeon-mi was slightly amused by this greeting, which made her try to hold back her laughter. Kantigan was surprised by this reaction and did not understand what was going on and what he had done wrong. The girl, walking into the apartment, said that the main character greeted her as if he were a real appa. Apartment. The girl immediately asked if the guy had cleaned up before her arrival. The main character was pleased that she noticed this and said that he couldn't invite her to a dirty apartment. After this, the guest looked into another room and was pleasantly surprised. She praised the guy for cleaning well. Kantigan offered the girl to drink coffee, during which she would continue to praise him. After some time, the hot drink was ready and poured into a beautiful pink cup. The girl praised the main character for making a great drink. The main character was pleased, thoughtfully said that they hadn't sat together like that for a long time. Jong Yeon-mi noticed this change in mood and seemed to immediately understand what the reason was. Obvious. Without answering, Jong Yeon-mi silently put her coffee cup aside. After this, the girl turned Kantigan's head towards her and began to closely examine his face. Jong Yeon-mi turned the main character's head from side to side, simultaneously kneading his cheeks. Soon the girl made some conclusions, and it seemed that she didn't like it very much. Kantigan did not understand what was happening and therefore asked what the girl was doing with his face. Jong Yeon-mi asked if the guy really thought was getting better. Jong Yeon-mi doubted these words, so she asked if the main character was telling her the truth. The young fireman took a sip of coffee and briefly replied that, of course, he was telling the truth. After this, the guy silently looked at his guest, surprised at how worried she was about him. Jong Yeon-mi also drank coffee silently and was completely immersed in her thoughts. Suddenly, the guy asked if the girl was really that worried about him. Jong Yeon-mi was surprised by such a sudden question. To do something. The guy turned Jong Yeon-mi's face towards himself and began to stare at her, continued to turn the girl's head from side to side. After that, the guy started saying that he had known the girl for 3 years already, and therefore, he probably knew, and so she gave him a break from herself. Kantigan looked at the girl with incomprehension and waited for her to finally tell him everything. Jong Yeon-mi was in no hurry to share her feelings, so she turned away from the main character and sat in silence. Then the young fireman asked if it was really so difficult for the girl to tell him everything straight out. Jong Yeon-mi reluctantly began to deny it, and then suddenly said that someone wanted to meet the guy. The main character immediately realized that they were talking about Jong Yeon-mi's father. He was shocked and did not understand why he wanted to meet him. Kantigan began to unconsciously remember that this man had already had countless conversations with him about breaking up with his daughter, that he was not suitable for his daughter. The guy thought about why this man wanted to meet him again. Since the last time Jong Yeon-mi timidly approached the guy and, hoping for the best, asked if he would go to meet her father. Kantigan answered briefly and calmly that if adults called, then one should always go. The girl was very surprised because she did not expect that the guy would not object to this at all. The main character also mysteriously said that he was sure that he was on the right path. Jean Yonmi was confused by this answer, so she frowned and asked what it meant. Jean Yonmi drank her coffee and looked at the main character without looking away, thinking about how today's meeting would go. Soon our heroes, having arrived by metro and having got off at the necessary stations, headed to the place where the meeting was planned. After some time, once inside, they immediately began to look around, looking for Jeong Yeonmi's father among the people. It turned out that Jeong Yeonmi and Kang Taegun arrived first, so they chose a suitable place for themselves and sat down at the table. The main character was noticeably nervous before this meeting, which is why he constantly touched his tie. Suddenly, something about Kang Taegun was afraid that his suit was stained with something. Jeong Yeonmi reassured him and said that everything was fine, but it would be better to fix something. Suddenly, the girl's face began to express anxiety and excitement about the upcoming meeting. Kang Taegun immediately noticed this and understood perfectly well what the reason was. The main character, in order to calm and hearing this, Jeong Yeonmi nodded her head slightly as if she agreed with the guy. Suddenly, our heroes heard a quiet cough behind. As they thought, in front of them stood Jeong Yeonmi's father, with whom Kang Taegun had planned to meet. Seeing the man, he immediately rose from the table. The man looked intently at the main character. It was clear that he was not delighted with this meeting. Meanwhile, Kang Taegun, when everyone was assembled, it was safe to say that this unpleasant meeting for everyone had begun. The restaurant worker carried 3 cups of hot coffee on a tray for customers. Approaching the table where our heroes were sitting, the woman smiled and said that their order was already ready. The waitress, a very lively atmosphere around. The woman realized that she was out of place here, so she quickly turned around and went to the other visitors. Unexpectedly, Kang Taegun turned to the waitress and thanked her for bringing their order quickly. Jeong Yeonmi's father began to say that there was no point in dragging things out for too long, surprised Kang Taegun greatly, but he did not dare to object to it or say anything else. Silence reigned between our heroes again because this was a really serious conversation that took time. Jeong Yeonmi could clearly feel the tense atmosphere surrounding her, which made her nervous and tremble with excitement. The girl tried to hold back this trembling, but her body did not listen to her. Unexpectedly, Kang Taegun placed his hand on Jeong Yeonmi's hands to calm her down. After that, the guy started saying that his profession was good and prestigious in our time. Man, more and more day by day. Hearing this, the man assumed that the guy wanted his daughter to suffer when something happened to the guy. Not to mention the small salary, the main character could die at this job at any moment. After this, the need happened. Then the man asked where there were guarantees that the fate of the main character, because she understood that a very painful topic for him had just been touched upon. It was clear that the man's question angered Kang Taegun, but he tried not to show. At the same time, the main character clenched his hand into a fist, trying to contain his anger. Father Jeong Yeonmi took Kang Taegun's words completely without understanding. Then the guy said that the firefighters who died at the scene sacrificed themselves for the sake of the people. Coffee and began to take large sips. The strong coffee helped Jeong Yeonmi's father return to his previous state, and so he was able to continue the conversation in the same manner. The man did not understand why the main character could not throw away his pity for these firefighters, since several months had already passed. Kang Taegun said that at first it was just a job for him. An unexpected man interrupted the boy and said that he could start all over again and choose a different path. But Kang Taegun believed that now was not the time to quit his job as a firefighter. Jeong Yeonmi's father also asked why the guy didn't want to quit this job. To this, the main character asked if the man had ever saved people. The man was very surprised by this question, but he did not understand what relation it had to their conversation. Kang Taegun continued to say that the man would not understand his feelings if he had never saved someone who was about to die. The main character also said that now only a few professions allowed people to save other people, and one of them was a professor of firefighting. Then the man asked if this was the only reason. The young fireman confidently answered that saving people made him feel alive. The protagonist explained that thanks to this work, he realized that someone needed him. The man, hearing this, began to insist that it was still dangerous work. Kang Taegun understood that the man was very worried about his daughter, and therefore, he was sure that he also made a lot of efforts to stay alive by would go and save them. The main character explained that he did all this because this someone was waiting for him to save him. The man admitted that the guy had changed since their last meeting. Then Kang Taegun suggested that the day would come when the man himself would invite him for a drink. Jeong Yeonmi's father began to Jeong Yeonmi and Kang Taegun. Getting up from the table, the man turned to his daughter and asked her to come to her senses. The girl did not understand what her father meant. The man didn't say anything else because he was already about to leave. Finally, he looked closely at the main character while adjusting his tie. The discouraged Khan Taegun did not forget about the rules of decency and therefore bowed respectfully to the man instead of saying goodbye. In turn, Jong Yeon-mi's father rewarded the protagonist with only a disdainful look. The discouraged Jong Yeon-mi and Kang Taegun silently watched the man go. This was the end of the meeting. The main character looked after Jong Yeon-mi's father and, remembering his contemptuous look, did not understand what just happened. After this, our heroes decided to take a walk around the city in order to come to their senses after such a difficult conversation. Jong Yeon-mi and Kang Taegun walked silently among the people, each thinking about something of their own and drawing conclusions from today's meeting. The girl was upset because she didn't expect her father to behave so rudely. Soon she looked at the main character, apparently about to ask him a question. Kang Taegun immediately noticed this, and I assumed that the girl grabbed the guy by the jacket and tried to stop him because she wanted to tell him something. Kang Taegun stopped and began to listen attentively to Jong Yeon-mi, not even suspecting what she wanted to tell him. It was obvious that it was difficult, asked if she could trust him and wait. The girl found it difficult to answer this question, and did not immediately notice that Jong Yeon-mi remained standing in place. Kang Taegun stopped again and looked at the girl, not understanding what the problem was. The protagonist saw that Jong Yeon-mi was biting her lower lip and